She walked in expecting a future. She walked out with a war. The night Arya Caldwell discovered her boyfriend tangled in silk sheets with her best friend, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked out of that bedroom like a woman who had already decided the world owed her nothing, and she would take everything anyway. But it was the man waiting at the bottom of the staircase who changed her life forever. Vincent Russo, the most feared name in the city, and he was looking at her like she was exactly what he'd been waiting for. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, slipped beneath the door of Arya's apartment in a cream-colored envelope thick enough to feel expensive just holding it. Dinner at the Russo estate. Saturday, 8 o'clock. Formal attire. No question mark. No please. Just the quiet authority of people who never needed to ask. She had smiled when she read it. Smiled the way a woman smiles when she believes she is finally about to arrive somewhere important. Now, standing in the driveway of the Russo family mansion, watching the valet take the keys to the taxi she could barely afford, Arya told herself the flutter in her chest was excitement. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 2 years loving Marco Russo, the charming, sharp-jawed, easy-laughing son of one of the most powerful families in the city, with everything she had. She had moved from a small town in Ohio to New York at 22, with one suitcase, a journalism degree, and the stubborn belief that she was meant for something bigger than the cornfields and quiet disappointments she'd left behind. Marco had found her at a fundraiser where she was covering a story. He'd leaned against the bar beside her, looked at her notepad, and said, "You're going to make me sound guilty of something, aren't you?" She had laughed. God, she had laughed. 2 years. 8 months of which she had spent saving, sacrificing, eating ramen on Tuesday nights so she could look like she belonged in his world on Friday evenings. She had never asked him for money, never let him pay her rent. She had a pride about her that ran bone deep, the kind that sometimes looked like stubbornness and sometimes looked like dignity, depending on who was watching. Tonight was supposed to be the night he introduced her properly to his father. The real introduction. The one that meant something. Marco had been nervous all week. "My father's not easy to impress," he'd said, "but you'll be fine. You're different from other women I've dated. He'll see that." She had taken that as a compliment. The mansion was everything money and intimidation could build. 3 stories of pale limestone, ivy growing deliberately along the east wing, iron gates that had been polished to the point where they reflected the sky like mirrors. The driveway alone was longer than her entire apartment building. Warm light spilled from every window, and somewhere inside a string quartet was playing something Arya didn't recognize but immediately wanted to. A butler, an actual butler, the kind with white gloves and a posture that communicated 30 years of practiced neutrality, opened the front door before she reached the top step. "Miss Caldwell," he said as though he'd been expecting her specifically. "Please come in." "Thank you," she said and stepped inside. The foyer was 2 stories high, dominated by a chandelier that she suspected cost more than she would earn in the next 5 years. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, portraits on the walls that watched you as you moved. The kind of house that made you feel immediately aware of your posture. She had texted Marco 3 times from the taxi. No response. She assumed he was with his father, doing whatever last-minute preparation the evening required. She smoothed her dress. Black, simple, elegant, bought on sale, and altered by a woman on 9th Avenue who had a gift for making affordable things look expensive, and followed the sound of voices toward the main hall. "Mr. Marco is upstairs," the butler said from behind her, "in the East Guest Suite. He asked me to let you know he'll be down shortly." She turned. "The East Guest Suite?" "Yes, ma'am. 3rd floor. He mentioned you might want to freshen up. The powder room on the 2nd floor is—" "I'll go up," she said. Something moved in the butler's face, the tiniest flicker. The practiced neutrality cracked, just for a fraction of a second, like ice shifting beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Then it sealed itself back into blankness. "Of course," he said. She should have noticed that flicker. She would think about it later, lying awake in the dark, replaying every second, and she would understand that the butler had known. Everyone in that house had probably known. Only she had walked in blind. The staircase was wide enough to drive a car up. She climbed it slowly, trailing her hand along the dark wood banister, listening to the sounds of the house. The string quartet below, The low murmur of guests beginning to arrive in the main hall. A clock somewhere, ticking with the authority of something that had always been in exactly this place and always would be. The East Guest Suite was at the end of the third-floor hallway. The door was not fully closed. That was the thing she would always remember. The door was not closed, not locked, not sealed, not even properly shut, just resting against the frame with a 2-inch gap that let soft amber light spill into the dim hallway like a secret that didn't know it was bleeding. She heard the sound first. She stopped walking. She stood in the hallway, very still, and she heard it. The low, unmistakable sound of a man laughing, intimate and loose and unguarded in the way that people only laugh when they believe no one is watching. And beneath it, a woman's voice, husky and familiar, saying something Arya couldn't quite make out. The voice was familiar. She pushed the door open. The room was large, lit by 2 lamps casting warm golden light over silk sheets and expensive furniture, and the 2 people tangled together in the center of it. Marco Russo, her Marco, lay with his shirt open and his hair disheveled, and curled against him, her dark hair fanned across his chest, was Danny Reeves. Danny, who had been Arya's closest friend for 4 years, who had cried on Arya's shoulder when her last relationship ended, who had helped Arya pick out this dress, who had told her 3 days ago, "He's lucky to have you, don't let anyone make you forget that." The world didn't spin, it didn't tilt, it simply went very, very quiet. Marco saw her first. His face went through a remarkable sequence of expressions in less than 3 seconds. Shock, guilt, calculation, and finally, with a speed that told her everything she needed to know about who he really was, a kind of resignation that looked almost like relief. "Arya, well, don't," she said. Her voice surprised her. It came out low and steady, stripped of everything except certainty. She had expected herself to cry. She had expected her voice to break, her knees to buckle, the careful architecture of the last 2 years to come apart around her like a burning building. Instead, she felt something strange and cold and clarifying move through her chest. Not numbness, but something beyond pain. Something that lived on the other side of it. Danny sat up, pulling the sheet to her chest, her face doing something complicated that involved the word sorry, but couldn't quite form it. Arya looked at her for a long moment, then she looked at Marco. "How long?" she asked. "Arya, it's complicated." "How long, Marco?" He had the grace, if you could call it that, to look away. 7 months. 7 months. She had been eating ramen on Tuesday nights for 7 months. She had been telling people, yes, we're serious, and I really think he's the one for 7 months. She had been building a future in her head, a small wedding, maybe, or a large one if his family insisted, a home that was hers and his, and finally, somewhere she belonged. For 7 months. And for 7 months, Danny had been sitting across from her at coffee, listening to her talk about that future. Something happened in Arya's chest, a door closing, a lock, turning, a sound like silence that was actually the sound of everything she had believed in up until that moment being reclassified, moved from the column marked real to the column marked mistake. She picked up her clutch from where she'd set it on the entrance table. She smoothed her dress again, a motion that was purely automatic. She looked at Marco Russo one final time, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you know it will be the last time. And she turned around and walked out of the room. She didn't slam the door. She pulled it gently closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. And then she walked down the hall, her heels silent on the thick carpet, her chin perfectly level, her spine straight enough to break something if necessary. She passed the portraits on the walls and the clock that ticked with such certainty, and the butler who materialized at the bottom of the second-floor landing with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pity, but somewhere in between. She reached the top of the grand staircase, and she stopped, because at the bottom of it, standing alone in the marble foyer with a crystal glass of something amber in his hand, was a man she had never met but immediately recognized, Vincent Russo. She knew his face from photographs, the kind of photographs that appeared in newspapers and then disappeared quickly, as though the publications thought better of drawing his attention. He was in his early 50s, though he carried the years differently than most men, the way certain materials age into something more formidable rather than simply worn. Tall, with broad shoulders beneath a charcoal suit that fit the way only very expensive suits fit. Silver threading through dark hair, a jaw cut sharp enough to cast a shadow. And eyes, dark eyes, still and watchful and utterly without performance, that were looking up at her with the particular attentiveness of a man who noticed everything and revealed nothing. He had been watching her. She didn't know for how long, but he was watching her now, and he didn't look away when she met his gaze, which told her immediately that he was not a man who pretended not to see things. She started down the staircase. Her legs moved on their own. Her hand found the banister. She counted steps without meaning to. Something to hold on to, some structure in the spinning. And she came down the full length of that staircase with her chin level and her eyes clear, and the cold thing in her chest keeping her upright with a discipline that surprised even her. She reached the bottom. Vincent Russo was 4 feet away. Up close, the stillness of him was even more pronounced. There was no nervous energy, no social performance, no warmth being offered as a kind of currency. Just attention. Direct, complete, unsettling attention. He looked at her face. He looked at her eyes. And whatever he saw there, it seemed to satisfy something in him. "You found them," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," she said, "and you came downstairs." "I did." He turned the glass slowly in his hand once, a small circular motion that seemed almost unconscious. Most women would still be up there screaming. I'm not most women. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. It was too controlled to be a smile, but the possibility of one, moving beneath the surface. "No," he said, after a pause that felt deliberate. "I can see that." The quartet was still playing in the main hall. Guests were beginning to filter through the east corridor toward the dining room, their voices layered and glossy with the particular brightness of people who are performing having a wonderful evening. None of them were paying attention to the foyer. The butler had vanished. It was just the two of them, standing in the marble light beneath the chandelier, and the silence between them was not awkward, but sharp. The silence of two people taking each other's measure. "He's been bringing her here for months," Vincent said. "Danny Reeves, the girl from your office." Arya blinked. Just once. "You knew?" "I know everything that happens in my house." He said it without apology, without even particular weight, just fact. "I told him 3 months ago that if he was going to end things with you, he should do it properly. He apparently decided to let you find out yourself." He paused. "I want you to know that was not my preference." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at him, this man who was her almost father-in-law, who ran an empire built on things she had been careful not to ask Marco too many questions about, who was standing in his own foyer on a dinner party evening confessing to her that he had failed to protect her from his son's cruelty, and she couldn't quite locate the appropriate emotional response. "That's very candid of you," she said. "I find candor useful." He tilted his head slightly. "Are you all right?" "No," she said, and then because the honesty surprised even her, she added, "But I will be." He studied her for another long moment. The clock ticked somewhere above them. The quartet shifted from one piece to another. Then Vincent Russo said something that Arya would spend the next weeks turning over in her hands like a stone she couldn't quite identify. "I have a proposal for you." She almost laughed. Almost. "A proposal." "Sit down with me," he said. "Not in there." He tilted his head toward the dining room. "My study. 5 minutes. You can say no and leave, and I'll have my driver take you wherever you'd like to go, or you can hear what I have to say. And if I'm not interested, then you walk out that door and I never bother you again." He said it simply, without injury. "But I think you'll be interested." She should have said no. She knew that, even in the moment. Every reasonable instinct she possessed was pointing toward the exit, toward the cab, toward her apartment, toward the rational and predictable process of grief and recovery that waited for her in the ordinary world outside those iron gates. But something in her was very tired of the ordinary world. 5 minutes, she said. Well, the study was at the far end of the ground floor, behind a door that looked like it belonged to a library and opened into a room that was half library, half something else. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk that was clearly the center of some serious work, chairs angled toward a fireplace that was lit low and quiet. On the desk, folders. On the shelves, books that had clearly been read. A room that was used. She sat in one of the chairs by the fire. Vincent sat in the other, without the glass now, leaning forward slightly with his forearms resting on his knees, which made him look less like a crime lord and more like a man who was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. My son is weak, he said. It was not the opening she expected. She said nothing. I don't say that to wound him. I say it as an observation. He has spent his entire life inside my protection, and it has made him careless. He doesn't understand consequence because he's never truly faced one. Vincent looked at the fire. What he did to you, not just tonight but the months before it, reflects badly on this family. On me. You don't owe me an apology, Arya said. No, I don't. He looked back at her. That's not what this is. Then what is this? He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, the dinner party was beginning, the sounds of silverware and conversation layering faintly through the thick walls. I'm 53 years old, Vincent said. I've run this organization for 22 years. In that time, I've watched men twice my size back down from a table because they couldn't hold eye contact. I've sat across from politicians and federal prosecutors and men who've put contracts on my life. He paused. And I just watched a 26-year-old woman walk down a staircase after discovering what you discovered with more composure than most people ever manage in a lifetime of practice. I was shaking, she said. I know, he said. You were shaking and you walked down anyway. There's a name for that. She said nothing. I need a wife, Vincent said. The words landed in the room with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said, not dramatically, just flatly, with the directness of a man who had decided to stop circling. She stopped, started again. That's an extraordinary thing to say to a woman whose relationship with your son just ended 15 minutes ago. Yes. You understand how this sounds. I understand exactly how it sounds. He reached forward and poured 2 glasses of water from a carafe on the table between them, a gesture so ordinary she almost smiled. He handed her one. There are several reasons. The first is strategic. I have rivals who are watching for weakness, and a man who runs what I run, alone, at my age, reads as vulnerable to certain people who would prefer to see me fail. A wife changes the calculation. A particular kind of wife changes it more significantly. What kind? One who isn't afraid of this world, he said. One who can walk into a room and hold it. One who won't break under pressure because she understands that pressure is simply the weight of other people's expectations. He tilted his head. You walked down that staircase. I walk downstairs regularly. His mouth curved, the possibility of a smile again, becoming more real this time. You know what I mean. She did know. She wasn't sure she wanted to admit it. What are the other reasons? He was quiet for a moment. My son needs to understand consequence, he said. Not punishment, not cruelty. Consequence. He needs to see that the woman he discarded, carelessly, shamefully, in my own house, did not disappear into grief, that she did not go back to obscurity and nurse her wounds in private. Something moved behind his eyes, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He needs to understand that his actions have a cost, and the cost, in this case, is watching you become something he could never make you. The fire was quiet. The clock ticked. You're offering me revenge, she said. I'm offering you power, he said. Revenge is what you'll feel. Power is what you'll have. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Marco upstairs, probably already rationalizing, already constructing the version of tonight that made him the reasonable one. She thought about Danny, 4 years of friendship, 4 years of shared confidences, of borrowed earrings and inside jokes, and the kind of intimacy that you build slowly with someone you trust completely, and felt something in her chest turn to stone. She thought about the apartment she went home to alone, the ramen on Tuesdays, the career that was going fine but not fast enough, the city that was enormous and indifferent, the gnawing quiet sense that she had been working towards something without quite knowing if she was building it or just waiting for it to arrive. She thought about the way Vincent Russo had looked at her at the bottom of the staircase, not with pity, with recognition. What would it involve, she said. A marriage, legal, formal, public. My lawyers would draw up an agreement. You would have financial security, protection, and access to everything that comes with my name. In return, you would be present when presence is required, and you would conduct yourself as my wife in every context that matters. He paused. The nature of the arrangement, beyond those parameters, would be yours to define. And if I want out eventually, The agreement would include exit terms, fair ones. I don't believe in trapping people. He said it as though the idea was faintly distasteful. People who stay because they want to stay are more reliable than people who stay because they have no choice. She drank from the glass of water, cold, clean. You don't know me, she said. I know enough. You watched me walk downstairs. I watched you walk downstairs the way you did, he said, after going through what you did, in a house full of people who were all, on some level, complicit in your humiliation. And you did it without drama and without collapse. He looked at her steadily. I've been watching people all my life. I know the difference between someone who is performing composure and someone who actually possesses it. You weren't performing. Arya set the glass down on the table between them. She looked at the fire. She thought about everything she had thought he was. The photographs, the name, the weight of the world he inhabited. And then she thought about what he had actually said to her in the last 10 minutes, and whether it matched. It did. Disturbingly well. It did. I want 24 hours, she said. You have it. And I want my own lawyers to review any agreement before I sign anything. Expected. And if I decide yes, I want it done quickly. I don't want weeks of negotiation and build-up. If we're doing this, we're doing it before anyone has the chance to talk me out of it. He looked at her with that same watchful stillness. Agreed. She stood up. He stood up with her, the automatic courtesy of a man from a generation that still did that. And she almost said something, but stopped herself. She picked up her clutch. 24 hours, she said. I'll be here, he said. She walked out of the study, back through the house with its marble floors and string quartet, and the sound of his dinner party continuing in blissful oblivion, and she walked through the front door the butler held open for her without being asked, and she walked down the stone steps to the driveway where the night air was cool and sharp and real. She stood for a moment at the bottom of the steps, looked up at the sky over the city, the kind of sky that is never truly dark because a city this size never fully sleeps. Her phone buzzed. Marco. Arya, please, can we just talk? She turned it face down and put it in her clutch. She called a taxi. She stood in the driveway of the Russo mansion and waited. And while she waited, she let herself feel, for the first and last time that night, the full weight of what had happened. The full weight of 7 months of a lie. Of a friend who had looked her in the eye and kept it. Of the version of the future she had been building quietly, devotedly, in the corner of her heart where she kept things she was afraid to say out loud in case saying them made them disappear. She felt it completely, the way you need to feel things in order to be done with them. Then she heard the taxi coming up the drive, and she picked up her chin, and she got in. She had 24 hours to decide. She already knew what she was going to say. The next morning, Arya Caldwell sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and 3 sheets of paper in front of her where she had written, in her careful journalist's hand, every argument she could think of for and against. The against column was longer, technically. It contained words like dangerous and impulsive and you don't know this man and this is not how rational people make decisions about their lives. It contained a note, underlined twice, that said he runs a crime organization, as though she needed reminding. As though she had somehow missed that particular detail in the conversation. The for column was shorter. It contained 5 things: power, protection. He looked at me like I was real. Marco will have to live with it. I am so tired of waiting for my life to start. She looked at the 5th item for a long time. Then she folded the paper in half, stood up, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and called the number on the card the butler had pressed quietly into her hand on her way out the door the previous evening. It rang once. Miss Caldwell, Vincent said. No surprise in his voice, just acknowledgement. Yes, she said. A brief silence, and then, I'll have my lawyers begin drawing up the agreement this afternoon. Your lawyers will receive copies by 6. All right, and Miss Caldwell? Yes? You won't regret this. She looked out the window of her apartment at the city that had been enormous and indifferent and was about to become something else entirely. I know. She said. The ceremony happened 8 days later. Arya had expected something small, a courthouse, a justice of the peace, the bureaucratic minimum of legal matrimony. What she got instead was an event that walked the careful line between private and deliberate, intimate enough to exclude the press, but large enough to ensure that everyone who needed to know would know immediately. It took place in the Russo mansion's East Garden, which in early October was still green and severe, the kind of beauty that doesn't ask for your approval. 30 guests, all of them people whose names meant something in the city. All of them watching with the particular attention of people trying to understand what they were witnessing and what it was going to mean for them. She wore ivory, not white, ivory, because she was 26 years old and honest with herself about what this was. A gown that was simple and structured and quietly devastating. The kind of dress that required a woman to carry it rather than the other way around. The Russo family's stylist had sent 3 options to her apartment that morning. She had chosen the one that required the least ceremony. Her own family was not there. Her mother was in Ohio, and Arya had called her the previous night. A conversation she would not fully be able to recall afterward, only the long silence on the line and her mother's voice saying, "Arya, are you sure?" And her own voice saying, "Yes, Mom, I'm sure." She had not explained everything. She had not tried. The 30 guests stood in the garden and watched Arya Caldwell, a girl from Ohio with a journalism degree and a carefully maintained pride, become Mrs. Vincent Russo, and on their faces she saw shock and calculation, and in a few of them, something that looked almost like respect. Marco was not there. He had been told the morning of, by his father's lawyer, via a letter that was brief and formal and left no room for response. Arya would learn later from one of the guards that he had put his fist through a wall in his apartment when he read it. She had felt, upon hearing this, not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it, the sound of a consequence landing. When Vincent slid the ring onto her finger, platinum, simple, clearly chosen with an eye toward what would suit her rather than what would announce itself, he looked at her with those still, dark eyes and said the required words with the kind of quiet authority that made them sound less like a ceremony and more like a decision that had already been made and was now simply being recorded. She said her words back to him. Her voice was steady. When it was over, he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked back into the house together as husband and wife. At the door, he paused, looked down at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like I just jumped off a building," she said, "and I'm waiting to find out if I have wings." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "That's a reasonable way to feel." And he walked her inside, into the life that was now hers, into the world that was now both her protection and her danger, into the house that would now be her home. Arya Caldwell had spent 26 years being invisible in rooms that didn't know her name. That was over now. The morning after this wedding, Arya woke up in a bedroom the size of her entire former apartment and lay very still for several minutes, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize, listening to a silence she hadn't yet learned to read. The room was on the second floor of the East Wing, her wing, as the housekeeper Mrs. Callahan had explained during the brief tour the previous evening, with the particular careful neutrality of someone who had learned long ago not to have opinions about the people she worked for. "Your wing, Mrs. Russo." The words had landed strangely. They still did. She sat up. The bed was enormous, the sheets expensive in the way that only revealed itself in how they felt against skin. Cool and smooth and weightless, nothing like the department store cotton she'd been sleeping on for years. Through the tall windows, October light came in thin and pale and honest. The city hummed somewhere below and beyond the estate walls, the low continuous sound of 10 million people going about the business of being alive. She was Mrs. Vincent Russo. The thought arrived with the same vertiginous quality it had possessed for the past 8 days. Not panic, exactly, but the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose depth she hadn't yet measured. She had made the decision with her eyes open. She had negotiated the terms with her own attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, who had reviewed the agreement with appropriate skepticism and ultimately said, "The terms protect you. Whether the situation itself protects you is a different question." Arya had signed anyway. She got up, washed her face, and dressed in the clothes she had brought from her apartment, which now felt subtly insufficient in a way she refused to be embarrassed about, and went downstairs. Vincent was already in the dining room, not at the head of the long formal table, which was laid for dinner service and clearly not in use, but at a smaller table near the windows where morning light collected and where a pot of coffee and 2 cups had been set, as though someone had anticipated company. He was reading a newspaper, a physical newspaper, folded in that particular way of people who had grown up with them, and he looked up when she came in without any performance of surprise. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." He set the paper down, gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. A woman, younger than Mrs. Callahan, quick and quiet, appeared immediately with a full breakfast that Arya hadn't ordered and found she wanted anyway. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Eventually, she poured coffee. "You?" "I don't sleep much." He said it as simple fact. "Never have. The house is quieter than it sounds from the outside." "I noticed." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "The garden wall absorbs the street noise." He looked at her with the faint quality of assessment she was beginning to recognize. Not intrusive, not threatening, just the habitual attentiveness of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and people. "You noticed that in one night." "I notice things. It's a job habit." "The journalism." Former journalism, now. She hadn't quite decided what she was now. "I put in my notice yesterday morning." Something moved in his expression. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She drank the coffee. It was very good. "I wanted to. I wasn't going to write fluff pieces about the city's cultural calendar while being married to you. It would have been insulting to both of us." She looked at him across the table. "I'd like to be useful, if you'll tell me what that means in this context." Vincent studied her for a moment. "Most people spend the first few weeks adjusting," he said, "learning the house, meeting the staff. I'm not most people. You said so yourself." The possibility of a smile moved across his face again, more fully this time. It transformed him subtly, not softening him exactly, but revealing something beneath the control that was less guarded. "No," he agreed. "You're not." He set down his coffee cup and leaned back slightly. "Then I'll tell you what the next few weeks will involve, and you can decide how useful you want to be." What followed was the most unusual breakfast conversation of Arya's life. Vincent spoke with the same directness he had employed in the study on the night they'd met. No softening of reality, no performance of reassurance. The organization he ran, which he referred to consistently as the business, never anything more specific, had both legitimate and less legitimate arms, and his wife, in all historical contexts, had been a visible presence in the legitimate ones. Charitable foundations, real estate development, 3 construction companies that were fully above board, 2 restaurants, a hotel in Midtown that had recently undergone renovation and was about to reopen. "The charitable work is real," he said, which was the only moment she caught something defensive in his voice, a very small defensiveness, quickly controlled. "I'm aware of what people assume when they hear my name. The foundation preceded the rest of it by years." "I believe you," she said. He looked at her as though he wasn't sure whether to. "I'm not naive," she said. "I know what the other parts of the business involve. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to ask you to justify it to me. But if the charitable work is real, I'll treat it as real. That's what I'm saying." A pause. "All right. What I need to know," she continued, "is who in this world knows what our arrangement actually is, and who believes it's something else." "My lawyer. My second in command, a man named Caruso. You'll meet him this week. And Mrs. Callahan, because she runs the house and hiding things from her is impossible." He paused. "Everyone else will form their own opinion. I'd prefer they believe it's genuine." "Then we need to be consistent," Arya said. "In public, at events, when we have people here. You'll need to brief me on who's who, what the dynamics are, what I should and shouldn't say in certain company. You're treating it like a role." "I'm treating it like a profession," she corrected. "There's a difference. A role is something you put on and take off. A profession is something you bring your actual self to." She met his eyes across the table. "I'm not going to perform being your wife. I'm going to actually be one, in every way that matters for this to work. That's the only way it functions." Vincent looked at her for a long, still moment. "Most people," he said finally, "are afraid of me." "I can see why," she said. "But being afraid of someone and being useful to them are mutually exclusive, so I'm choosing not to be." "Just like that." "Just like that," she agreed. "I can be afraid later if it becomes necessary." He picked up his coffee. He said nothing for a moment, and in that moment Arya had the distinct sensation of something shifting, not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the small, real way that things shift when a decision that was theoretical becomes actual. "His name is Caruso," Vincent said. "He'll come tomorrow morning. I'll have him walk you through the structure. After that, we'll start with events. There's a foundation gala in 3 weeks that will be your first public appearance. It will be noticed. Good, she said. She meant it. She wanted to be noticed. She wanted every person in this city who had ever looked through Arya Caldwell to see exactly where she had landed. Luca Caruso arrived at 9 the following morning. A man in his late 40s, compact and precise, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the kind of permanently watchful eyes that reminded Arya of a chess player who was always running 3 moves ahead. He shook her hand with exactly the correct amount of pressure and looked at her with an appraisal that was professional rather than personal. Mrs. Russo, he said. Mr. Caruso. But Vincent had meetings in the city that day, a legal matter involving one of the construction companies, handled by lawyers but requiring his physical presence as a signal of something Arya didn't ask about. He had left them with coffee and the instruction to tell her whatever she needs to know, which Caruso treated as the directive it was. They sat in the study, the same room where Vincent had made his proposal 10 days ago, which Arya was beginning to understand functioned as the actual operational center of the house. And for 3 hours, Caruso laid out the world she had entered with the methodical clarity of a man who had built his professional identity around leaving nothing ambiguous. The Russo organization had operated in the city for 30 years, founded by Vincent's own father, and handed to Vincent at the age of 31 when the elder Russo died of a stroke at his desk. A detail Caruso delivered without visible emotion, and which Arya filed away. It had 4 main rival families currently in operation in the greater metropolitan area, 3 of which maintained an uneasy but functional peace with Vincent through a combination of negotiated territory and mutual recognition that war was expensive. The 4th, a relatively newer organization operating under a man named Soren Kessler, was less interested in peace. Kessler, she said, Eastern European, arrived in the city 6 years ago. Expanded faster than most do because he doesn't worry about creating enemies the way established organizations do. Caruso's voice was even, informational. He's been testing the edges of our territory for the past 18 months, mostly economically, pressuring businesses that work with us, that kind of thing. Nothing that required a direct response yet. Yet, she said. Yet, he agreed. And the marriage changes this dynamic how? Caruso looked at her with something that might have been respect, the faintest edge of it. 2 ways, the positive way. It sends a signal that Vincent is stable and consolidated. A man who marries, who brings a wife into the public sphere, is making a statement about permanence, about confidence. He paused. The negative way, you become a point of vulnerability. A target, a potential target. People who want to pressure Vincent will look at what he values. He said it carefully, not cruelly. A new wife is visible, untested in this environment. It makes a certain kind of man think about leverage. Arya absorbed this. What's the security protocol? Caruso blinked, just once. It was the most visible surprise she had yet seen on his face. You want to discuss? I want to understand my situation, she said. All of it. If I'm going to be a liability in one sense, I'd like to mitigate that as much as possible. So, what's the protocol? He told her. 2-person security detail whenever she left the estate, currently assigned to a man named Reed, a former military contractor in his 30s who was, according to Caruso, both competent and discreet. The estate itself had a 12-person security rotation. There were cameras, a perimeter system, and protocols for scenarios that Arya listened to with the focused attention of someone who intended to remember all of it. When Caruso finished, he looked at her across the desk. May I say something, Mrs. Russo? Please. I've worked for Vincent for 19 years. In that time, I've watched him navigate situations that would have destroyed most men. He paused, and in the pause, something human appeared briefly in the professional surface. I was skeptical when he told me about this arrangement. I want you to know that. Was, she said. You asked about the security protocol, he said. Before you asked anything else. He picked up his coffee. That was the right question to ask first. Reed introduced himself the following morning in the East Garden. A compact, broad-shouldered man with sandy hair and an expression of professional pleasantness that she suspected covered a considerable amount of professional seriousness. He walked her through the estate's perimeter with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had thought about every angle of every approach, and Arya walked beside him and paid attention. You'll need to tell me your schedule as far in advance as possible, Reed said, as they completed the circuit of the garden wall. Not because I need to approve it, just so I can route accordingly. Understood. I'll send you a calendar invite. He looked at her sideways. Most principals don't do that. I'm not most principals. She was getting tired of saying versions of that sentence, but it kept being true. I'd rather make your job easier than maintain the fiction that I'm not being guarded. Reed nodded. Something settled in his posture. The particular relaxation of someone who has braced for a difficult working relationship and discovered instead that it might be manageable. Good, he said. That helps. Life inside the Russo estate settled into a rhythm over the following 2 weeks that was simultaneously nothing like anything Arya had experienced, and in certain functional ways, not entirely unlike the organized intensity of a good newsroom. There were schedules and hierarchies and information flowing constantly through channels she was gradually learning to read. There were people who needed managing, not unkindly, but clearly, and there was an enormous amount to absorb. Vincent was present at breakfast most mornings. He kept late hours, returning from meetings in the city at times that ranged from 9 in the evening to past midnight, and she learned quickly not to wait up in any pointed way, not because she was indifferent, but because pointedness was not the language this arrangement spoke. They ate breakfast and discussed what needed to be discussed. On 2 evenings, he arrived early enough that they ate dinner together in the smaller dining room, and those evenings were not awkward, which surprised her. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people who had things to say and were still in the process of deciding which of them to say first. She was reorganizing the Foundation's communication strategy, something she had undertaken with Vincent's quiet approval after reviewing their existing materials and finding them generic to the point of invisibility when she first encountered Marco. It was a Wednesday, 11 days after the wedding. She was coming back from a meeting at the Foundation's offices in Midtown with Reed. Her first time in the city in her new capacity, carefully low-key, just a meeting with the Foundation's communications director. Nothing that would appear in any social column. They pulled through the estate gate in the early evening, the sky going that particular shade of October charcoal, and she saw his car immediately, a silver Porsche she recognized, parked at an angle in the driveway that communicated rage, the particular careless angle of someone who had arrived in an emotional state. She got out of the car. Reed got out a half step ahead of her, which she noted without looking at him. Marco was standing on the front steps. He looked the way she had never seen him look before, unmade, somehow. The glossy confidence that had always been his primary surface was gone, stripped away, and what was underneath was younger and less impressive. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright with something she recognized, after a moment, as genuine desperation. "Arya," he said. "Marco." She walked toward the steps with the same steadiness that seemed to be becoming her default register. "You should have called. You blocked my number." "Yes," she said, intentionally. He came down 2 steps. Reed moved with her, fluid and quiet, and Marco's eyes darted to him and then back. "Can we talk? Just 5 minutes?" "We don't have anything to talk about," she said. Not cruelly, simply. "You married my father." His voice broke on the word, not with grief, but with something that was bewilderment layered over fury. "You married my father, Arya. Do you understand how... Can you even hear how insane that is?" She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, the way she hadn't done that night in the mansion hallway. She had been moving then, propelled forward, and she hadn't allowed herself to stop. She looked at him now. He was handsome in the conventional way he had always been handsome, and he had a charm that she had once found intoxicating, and for 7 months he had looked at her with those dark eyes and told her things that were not true. "You were in that room for 7 months," she said. "Not me." "That was different." "It wasn't," she said. "It was exactly what it looked like, and I chose not to fall apart over it. Those are the only facts that matter." "He's using you." His voice lowered, urgent. You think he actually..." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "He does this. He moves people around like pieces. You're not a person to him. You're a..." "I think you should stop," she said, "before you say something that makes me angry. Because right now I don't feel angry. I feel very little, actually, and I'd like to keep it that way." He stared at her. "Tell me something," she said, and she heard the question coming out of her before she'd consciously decided to ask it. In 7 months. Did it occur to you once, even once, that I would find out? He opened his mouth, closed it. Because I think it didn't, she said. I think you never believed I was paying close enough attention. I think you counted on me not to notice because that's what you thought of me. She held his gaze. I noticed everything, Marco. I just trusted you anyway. That's on me. But underestimating me, that one's entirely on you. He said nothing. Go home, she said. Don't come here again without calling Vincent first. She walked past him up the steps, and the butler held the door, and she walked inside. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The Foundation Gala was on a Thursday evening in November, a converted warehouse space in Lower Manhattan that the Foundation's events team had transformed into something elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of event that communicated serious money but not the need to prove it. 400 guests. The full ecosystem of legitimate power in the city. Politicians, philanthropists, business leaders, a careful scattering of cultural figures, and the watching eyes of the underworld's legitimate fringe, the people who lived in the overlap between Vincent's world and the above-board one, the ones who knew what his name actually meant and were here partly to assess what the presence of a new wife signified. She knew this. Caruso had briefed her. She had spent the previous 2 evenings reviewing every name on the guest list that Caruso had flagged as significant, had memorized faces from photographs with the same discipline she had once applied to research for investigative pieces, and had assembled an understanding of the room's social geography before she set foot in it. The dress was dark green, a color she had chosen deliberately, something that announced itself without asking permission. The stylist the Russo staff employed had sent 6 options. She had chosen this one immediately and sent the others back without deliberation. The stylist had called it a statement. Arya had called it armor. She and Vincent arrived together, as was now simply the reality of their life. In the car, he had reviewed 2 final names with her, a city council member who was navigating some complex regulatory issues with one of the construction companies, and a foundation board member whose opinion about the organization's future direction mattered more than his official title suggested. She had listened, asked 2 questions that made Vincent pause before answering, and stored the information in the place where her mind kept things it intended to use. When they walked into the gala, the room registered them. She felt it, the subtle collective shift of attention, the way the nearest conversations paused by a fraction, the eyes that moved and then moved away and then came back. She had been in rooms where she was noticed before, but always on the periphery, always as the journalist or Marco's girlfriend or some other auxiliary role. This was different. This was the room noticing her because of what she was, not what she was adjacent to. She stood straight. She smiled at the right moments. She spoke when spoken to with the kind of effortless warmth that she had always had in professional contexts, but had sometimes lost in personal ones. A journalist's ability to make someone feel heard and interesting, which was the most underrated social skill she possessed. She navigated the room with the mental map she had built from the guest list, finding the council member at the bar, and opening a conversation that lasted 8 minutes and ended with his business card in her clutch, and the distinct impression that she had managed to be both charming and useful without being either obsequious or threatening. At some point in the middle of the evening, she found herself standing beside Vincent at the edge of the main room, both of them holding champagne they were only nominally drinking, watching the room the way 2 people watch a room they are simultaneously part of and assessing. You've spoken to 11 of the 30 names Caruso flagged, he said, without looking at her. 12, she said. I got to the woman from the Arts Council while you were with the senator. He was quiet for a moment. You retained all of that. I'm good at faces and context. She watched a cluster of guests near the center of the room. The man in the gray suit, northwest corner, he keeps looking at you in a way that's doing something other than admiring your jacket. Vincent's gaze moved very slightly. Alderman Price, he said. He's been having a complicated relationship with one of our development projects. He's fine. He doesn't look fine. He's fine, Vincent said with the quiet authority of someone who knows things they aren't elaborating on. But you're right that he's watching. A pause. You're good at this. I spent 4 years in rooms where I had to identify who was telling the truth and who was performing, she said. The skill transfers. He looked at her then. Not the peripheral attention she had grown accustomed to, but direct full attention. In the amber light of the gala, with the sound of the room around them, and the weight of every watching eye doing its arithmetic, he looked at her with something that was not the assessment she had grown used to, but something she couldn't quite name yet. "People will talk tomorrow," he said, "about tonight." "I know. It won't all be kind." "It never is," she said, "but it'll be loud, and loud is what we need." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the room. "There's someone I need you to meet," he said. "A woman named Gloria Park. She sits on the hospital board, the one attached to the Foundation's Medical Access Initiative. She's been skeptical about expanding the initiative's scope. She'll listen to you differently than she listens to me." "What do I need to know about her?" "She lost her younger sister to a preventable condition 12 years ago. The Foundation's medical access work is personal for her, whether she admits it or not." He paused. "Don't use that as a lever. Just let her know the work is real." Arya looked at him. "You care about the Foundation." He didn't answer immediately. Then, something started his strategy and became something else. "Yes." She nodded. "Take me to Gloria Park," she said. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked back into the room together, and the room watched them with the complete helpless attention of people witnessing something they haven't yet found the right word for. It was 3 days after the gala that Arya first understood, with her whole body rather than just her mind, exactly what world she was living in. She was in the garden, in the late afternoon, reviewing Foundation documents with a cup of tea going cold beside her. Reed was at a respectful distance near the garden wall. The day was gray and still, the November light doing its annual disappearing act, and the estate was quiet in the particular way it got between mid-afternoon and evening, when the shift changed and the house held its breath. She heard it first. Raised voices from inside, somewhere deep in the house, not words but tone, hard and fast and cut through with something urgent. Then Mrs. Callahan appeared at the garden door with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that was not at all neutral. "Mrs. Russo," she said, "Mr. Russo asks if you could come inside." She went inside. In the main corridor, 2 men she didn't recognize stood with Caruso, men whose body language was different from the usual staff, harder, taking up space differently. And Vincent was on the phone, pacing in front of his study door, speaking in a tone she hadn't heard from him before. Not louder. Tighter. The controlled version of something that under different management would have been fury. He looked up when he saw her. He ended the call. "Arya," he said, "go to your wing and stay there for the next hour." She looked at Caruso, who was looking at a point 6 inches to the left of her face. She looked at the 2 men who were looking at the floor. She looked at Vincent. "Tell me what happened," she said. "I'll explain." "Tell me now." He looked at her for a beat. Then he made a decision she could see him make. A small shift in his posture, a closing off of the version of the conversation where he managed what she knew. "We received communication," he said, "from Kessler's people. The rival." "Yes." He paused. "They're aware that you exist, that you matter to me. They wanted us to know that they're aware." The garden was visible through the window behind him, still and gray and quiet, the wall at its far end solid and high. Arya looked at it for a moment. Then she looked back at Vincent. "So Caruso was right," she said. "I'm a target." "You're not." "Don't," she said. Not sharply, just firmly. "You told me the world I was entering. I agreed to enter it. I'm not going to fall apart because the reality is confirming what you told me. I just need to know exactly what the situation is so I can be intelligent about it." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. In his face, she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not the control, not the assessment, but underneath both of those, something that looked very much like worry. Not for the situation, for her. She filed that away in the place where she kept things she needed to think about later. "The protocol changes starting tonight," he said. "Reed gets a second person. You don't go anywhere without both of them. We're going to increase the perimeter coverage on the estate." He paused. "And I need to know if you want to renegotiate our arrangement. In light of—" "No," she said. Arya saw— "No," she said again. "I walked into this knowing the risks. Being threatened by people who want to use me as leverage against you is not a reason to leave. It's a reason to make it very clear to those people that I am not easy to use as leverage." He stared at her. "I'm going to need you to tell me more about Kessler," she said. "Not everything, but enough. Because I can't be intelligent about a situation I can't see." The house was quiet around them. Caruso and the two men had gone. She hadn't noticed them leave. It was just her and Vincent in the corridor, and the light coming through the tall windows was going gray-gold with the beginning of evening, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her from the bottom of the staircase that first night, like she was something he hadn't been prepared for. "Sit down with me," he said. "Yes," she said, and she followed him into the study, and she shut the door behind her, and she sat down, and she listened, and what Vincent Russo told her about Soren Kessler in the next hour would change how she understood everything that had come before, and everything that was still coming. She didn't know yet what was coming, but she was ready for it. That much at least she was sure of. What Vincent told her about Soren Kessler took an hour, and when it was over, Arya sat very still in the study chair and understood, perhaps for the first time with her full body rather than just her reasoning mind, the specific weight of the world she had married into. Kessler had arrived in the city 6 years ago from somewhere in Eastern Europe. Vincent said the country, but Arya understood that the geography mattered less than the method. He had expanded by doing what established organizations never did, absorbing the losses that came from moving fast, burning relationships that careful men would have preserved, and treating every negotiated boundary as a temporary inconvenience rather than a binding agreement. He was 41 years old. He had no family on record. He had no particular loyalty to any principle except accumulation. "He's been making moves on the waterfront operations," Vincent said. "3 of our shipping partners have received visits in the last 2 months. Visits that were framed as introductions but were actually ultimatums." "And they came to you?" "2 of them did, immediately." A pause. "The third waited a week, which tells me conversations happened that I wasn't part of. Is the third partner a problem?" Vincent looked at her with the faint expression she had come to recognize as recalibration, the moment when he adjusted his expectation of what she was capable of processing. "He might be," he said. "We're watching." "And the communication you received today, was it a threat against me specifically, or a general statement that they know I exist?" "The language was careful," he said. "They know we received the first kind of message 2 weeks ago, the one Caruso briefed you on. Today's was a step further. They used your name." She absorbed that. Her name, in the mouth of someone she had never met, being deployed as a pressure point against the man she had married. It was a particular kind of violation. Not physical, not yet, but intimate in its way. The knowledge that strangers were studying the structure of her life, looking for the place where pulling one thread would make something collapse. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, not quite a question. "I mean, I understand the situation," she said. "What's your plan for Kessler?" "Currently, patience. Responding to provocation gives him the engagement he's looking for. Kessler operates on attention. He needs his targets to react so he can read them." Vincent's voice was controlled, but beneath it she could hear the things she had only begun to be able to detect, the low, steady frequency of a man managing something that was costing him more than he showed. "The moment we respond, we define the terms of the conflict on his schedule. So you wait." "We wait, and we make sure every pressure point he's identified is reinforced." He looked at her. "Including you." "I'm not a pressure point," she said quietly. "I'm a person." "Yes," he said, "and in this world, those two things coexist." He said it without apology, not cruelly but honestly the way he said everything. "I'm sorry, that's the reality." "Don't apologize," she said. "I knew it. I just needed to hear you say it plainly." She looked at the fire. "What does reinforcing me look like?" "The security increases we discussed, and," he paused, "staying visible, publicly. Disappearing would read as weakness, as though the message landed and produced the intended effect. We need to continue as planned." "The charity board meeting next week?" "Yes." "And the dinner at the Mancuso estate Thursday?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then we continue," she said. "That's fine." She looked back at him. "What I need from you is information as things develop, not a summary after the fact, actual information as it comes in. I can't function as a visible, steady presence if I'm working with incomplete data." He studied her for a long moment. "There are things I won't be able to tell you," he said. "Not because I don't trust you, because the less you know about certain operations, the safer you are in certain contexts." "I understand the distinction," she said, I'm not asking to know everything. I'm asking to know what affects my safety and my ability to do what you need me to do. That, he said, I can commit to. She stood up. The study had gone fully dark while they talked, the November evening pressing flat and black against the windows. Someone had come in quietly at some point and lit another lamp, and the room was warm in the contained amber way that she was starting to associate with the feeling of something being managed rather than simply comfortable. I'm going upstairs, she said. I'll tell Reed the protocol changes he needs to know about tonight. She was at the door when Vincent spoke. Arya, she turned. He was still in the chair, but he was looking at her with the expression she had no name for yet. The one that was not assessment, not the careful watchfulness of a man running calculations, but something quieter and more exposed. It appeared rarely and briefly, and she had learned to notice it the way you learn to notice birds that only land for a moment before they go. Thank you, he said, for not making this harder than it already is. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth. And she went upstairs, and she stood in her room in the dark for a while before turning on the light, and she let herself feel, quietly and privately, the full weight of the word scared. And then she put it away, and she called Reed, and she told him what he needed to know. The days that followed were ordinary in the way that only days containing a suppressed threat can be ordinary. Too careful, too deliberate. The surface of normalcy maintained with the constant low-level effort of people who know what is moving beneath it. The security detail expanded as promised. Reed's new partner was a woman named Torres, dark-haired and efficient, whose presence Arya found unexpectedly reassuring. Not because Torres was softer, but because she was different, and different meant the coverage was less predictable. The charity board meeting happened. The dinner at the Mancuso estate happened. Both were navigated with the combination of preparation and adaptability that Arya was developing into something approaching instinct. Elena Mancuso, wife of Vincent's longest-standing ally, a man named Dominic Mancuso, whose relationship with Vincent went back 23 years, had welcomed Arya with a warmth that was not precisely genuine, but was not precisely false either. It was the warmth of a woman who had been in this world long enough to understand that the wife of a powerful man deserved a certain baseline of respect regardless of personal feeling, and who was curious enough about this particular wife to suspend judgment pending further information. You're younger than I expected, Elena said, over pre-dinner drinks in a sitting room that was twice the size of Arya's former apartment. I'm younger than most people expect, Arya said pleasantly. Vincent hasn't... Elena paused, choosing. He hasn't had a companion, in any sense, since Marco's mother. That was a long time ago. I know, Arya said. People will wonder what you are to him. People always wonder things, Arya said. I've found it's better to let them wonder than to explain. Explanations invite debate. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised. I think, she said, that you might be exactly what he needs. I think, Arya said, that we'll see. It was the following Tuesday, 18 days after the initial communication from Kessler's organization, that the situation moved from Cold War to something warmer and considerably more dangerous. She was in the city. A legitimate errand, a meeting with the Foundation's new communications director, a woman named Priya Ose, whom Arya had been working with on the revised outreach strategy, and whose instincts she was beginning to genuinely value. The meeting was at the Foundation's offices in Midtown. Reed and Torres were with her. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and cold, the city doing its November thing with a kind of aggressive efficiency. The meeting ran long. Priya was thorough, and so was Arya, and there were things to decide about the spring campaign that required actual conversation rather than the email exchange they'd been conducting. They finished at 5:30, which meant the Midtown streets were in full evening rush condition, packed sidewalks, slow traffic, the particular urban density that makes movement into a negotiation with 400 people simultaneously. They were half a block from the parking structure where the car waited. Reed was on her left, Torres slightly behind her right shoulder. The sidewalk was crowded in the normal way. She noticed the van because it was idling, not parked, idling, engine running, in a loading zone that did not have anything being loaded into or out of it. A white van, unremarkable in every detail, which was itself a kind of detail. She had been in this world long enough to know that unremarkable things placed strategically were doing something. She said quietly without altering her pace, Reed. I see it, he said, already closer to her, his voice completely level. Three things happened in rapid succession. The van's side door opened. Torres stepped in front of Arya from the right, and Reed said very calmly, into the earpiece she had learned he wore at all times, "We need extraction, 47th and Lex, now." The two men who came out of the van were not running. That was the thing that registered most clearly. They were not running. They were walking with the particular deliberate pace of people who had been told that running creates panic and panic creates witnesses. They were large. They were wearing the anonymous clothes of people who had dressed to be forgotten. What happened next was approximately 40 seconds of compressed, violent clarity that Arya would afterward remember not as a sequence of events but as a series of still images, each one precise. Reed moving between her and the nearer of the two men with a speed that registered as something other than human, until she understood that this was simply what training looked like when it was very good. Torres with her hand on Arya's arm, moving her backward toward the building wall, away from the sidewalk's edge, her voice saying, "Stay behind me, stay tight, don't run yet," in the same tone someone would use to give directions to a coffee shop. The nearer man reaching Reed and the exchange that followed, swift, contained, professional on both sides, the kind of violence that is almost geometric in its efficiency. Reed was better. A black car, not theirs, one she didn't recognize, pulling to the curb with the specific urgency of something that had been sent rather than happened to arrive. Caruso getting out of the passenger side. "In the car," he said to Arya, with the compact authority of someone who was running on about 4 different frequencies simultaneously. "Right now." She got in the car. Torres got in beside her. The door closed. Through the window she could see Reed, standing, which was the first thing she checked, and the two men who were no longer standing, and the white van already moving, pulling away from the curb at the pace of something that had just lost its nerve. The car moved. Caruso, from the front seat, was on his phone saying things in a low, rapid voice that she couldn't fully parse over the sound of the blood in her ears. Arya sat in the back seat and breathed. She breathed carefully, the way you breathe when you need to communicate to your body that the danger has passed even before you're entirely sure it has. Torres was beside her, watching her with the professional calm of someone assessing for shock. "I'm fine," Arya said. "I know," Torres said. "Breathe anyway." She breathed. By the time they reached the estate, a drive that took 22 minutes and felt like a different unit of time entirely, the shaking she had suppressed in the car had moved from her hands to somewhere deeper, a whole-body tremor that was purely physiological and had nothing to do with whether she was afraid. She had been afraid. She was still afraid. She had simply decided that the fear was information rather than instruction. Vincent was in the foyer when they came through the door. He was already there. She didn't know how he had gotten word so quickly, but she supposed that was the nature of the system he had built. He was still in his coat, as though he had come in only minutes before her, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do. He crossed the foyer in 6 strides and stopped directly in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He looked at her. All of her, the way you look at someone when you need to confirm with your own eyes what words have already told you. His jaw was tight, his hands were at his sides, and she noticed that they were not entirely still. "Arya," he said. Just her name, like it needed saying. "I'm all right," she said. Reed and Torres handled it. "I did what they told me to do." She paused. "There were 2 of them. A van? It was planned." "I know." Something moved through his voice that she had never heard there before. Something raw, quickly suppressed, that existed for only a fraction of a second before the control reasserted itself. "Come inside." She followed him to the study. Mrs. Callahan appeared at some point with tea that Arya drank without tasting. Caruso came in behind them and stood by the door with his arms crossed and his expression in its professional closed mode, which she now recognized as the mask he wore when something was working on him that he didn't want visible. "Tell me exactly what happened," Vincent said. "From your perspective. Everything." She told him. She was thorough, because thoroughness was the mode she fell into when she needed to stay functional, and because she understood that the details mattered. The van idling, the specific timing, the way the 2 men had moved. Vincent listened without interrupting. His face was very still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You noticed the van, he said. Yes. Before Reed did. At the same time, I think. She paused. I've been paying attention. You told me to pay attention. I told you to stay safe. I don't know that I told you to... He stopped. Something about the sentence didn't have a clean ending. You weren't afraid. I was extremely afraid, she said. I just didn't let it make decisions for me. He looked at her across the desk, and in his face, beneath the tight, controlled anger that was clearly directed at Kessler and the situation rather than at her, she saw the thing she had seen from the study doorway, that exposed, unguarded thing that appeared rarely and briefly. It was there longer this time, long enough for her to see it clearly. He was afraid too, not for himself. I'm going to handle Kessler, he said. His voice had changed. Not louder, never louder with him, but denser, like something had been compressed into it. The patience is over. What does that mean? She said. It means the calculation has changed. He looked at Caruso. Get Ricci on the phone and find me everything we have on Kessler's current operations downtown. Caruso straightened. Yes. He was already moving. Vincent, Arya said. He looked at her. Whatever you do, she said carefully, be sure it's a decision and not a reaction. Those are different things. Reactions give people what they were trying to get. He was still for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Small, involuntary thing, like a door opening by an inch. You're right, he said. I know, she said. I'm also telling you that I'm not going to be used as someone's leverage. If Kessler wants to apply pressure through me, he's going to find out that I'm not the pressure point he thinks I am. She paused. But that only works if we're coordinated. So tell me what you're planning. He told her. Not everything. She had not expected everything, but enough. The shape of the response he was constructing, the parties who would be involved, the line he intended to draw in a way that Kessler would not be able to misread. She listened. She asked 3 questions. 2 of them made Vincent pause before he answered, and in those pauses she felt, oddly, something almost like solidarity, the strange closeness of 2 people thinking through a hard problem together. The revelation came 11 days later, and it came from the direction she least expected. It was a Thursday morning, and she was in the small sitting room off the east corridor, a room she had quietly claimed as a working space, converting the decorative table by the window into a functional desk where she spread foundation documents and strategic plans, and the notes she kept in the rapid shorthand she had developed as a journalist and never quite abandoned. The morning light was thin and cold, and she had a second cup of coffee going, and she was annotating a grant proposal from a community health clinic when Caruso knocked. She looked up. His face was in its closed mode, but there was something beneath it, a tightness around the eyes, an extra stillness, that she had learned to read as distinct from his ordinary professional neutrality. This was not the neutrality of a man holding information calmly. This was the neutrality of a man holding information that was costing him something. Sit down, she said before he could speak. He sat. He placed a folder on the table between them. He did not open it. I need to tell you something, he said, before I tell Vincent. She looked at the folder. She looked at Caruso. All right. The communication from Kessler's organization, he said, the one that used your name, our people traced the origin of the information, specifically how Kessler knew details about your schedule, your routine inside the estate, the specific timing of your movements. A pause. He shouldn't have known those things, not from external observation. The estate's security is internal, she said. The word arrived before she had consciously assembled it. Someone inside provided information. Yes. Who? Caruso opened the folder. He turned it to face her. She looked at the documents. She looked at them for a long time. She read what was there with the same systematic attention she had applied to investigative research for years, the part of her that was professionally trained, not letting the part of her that was a person react until the professional part had finished processing. When she was done, she looked up at Caruso. Marco, she said. Yes. She sat with it. She sat with the full shape of it, not the abstract knowledge that Marco resented this marriage, not the general awareness that his humiliation had curdled into something more dangerous, but the specific documented reality that her husband's son had provided Soren Kessler's organization with information about her schedule, about the days she went into the city, about the route the car typically took, about the specific afternoon of the meeting at the Foundation offices. He had tried to have her abducted. Not Kessler's idea, not Kessler's initiative. Kessler had been provided a tool and had used it, but the hand that had offered the tool was Marco's. "How sure are you?" she said. "Certain," Caruso said. "The communication trail is documented. There were 3 contacts over 10 days. The first was an introduction. We believe Marco reached out to Kessler's people independently, offering information in exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for what?" A pause. "The communication implies he wanted the marriage disrupted. That if the situation became untenable, you would leave." Caruso's voice was very careful. "He appears to have believed that if you were frightened enough, you would exit the arrangement." She absorbed this. She thought about Marco on the front steps. He's using you. You're not a person to him. And understood now that the speech had not been concern. It had been a man trying to accomplish with words what he was simultaneously arranging to accomplish with something far more dangerous. "He didn't think they'd actually hurt me," she said. Not forgiving it, just understanding it. "Probably not," Caruso said, which suggests he doesn't fully understand the world he made contact with. "He understands it enough to have grown up inside it," she said. "He just thought he was protected by whose son he is." She looked at the folder. "Does Vincent know?" "Not yet. I came to you first because—" Caruso stopped. He looked for a moment less like the most controlled person in any room and more like a man who was genuinely uncertain. "Because I've been in this organization for 19 years. I know what Vincent will do when he finds out, and I needed another stop. I needed someone else to know first, someone who would think about what happens next." She looked at him. She understood what he was asking her. He was asking her to be the thing that came between Vincent's knowledge and Vincent's reaction. The same thing she had asked Vincent to be for himself after the abduction attempt. He was asking her to help manage a piece of information that had the potential to cause a catastrophic response. Because what Vincent would feel when he learned that his son had provided coordinates for the abduction of his wife would not be manageable through ordinary means. And Caruso, who had known this man for 19 years, knew that. "Does anyone else know?" she said. "Ricci. He was the one who traced it. He came to me this morning. Tell Ricci to hold it 24 hours, not to discuss it with anyone else on the team." She closed the folder. "I'll tell Vincent." Caruso looked at her. I understand what it will do to him," she said. "That's why I need to be the one to tell him, because I can be in the room with what it does to him. Most people can't." A long pause. "All right," Caruso said. He stood. He picked up the folder and placed it back on the table in front of her. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has revised his understanding of something. "I was wrong about you," he said. "When Vincent first told me, I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said. "You were." He left. She sat alone in the sitting room with the folder on the table and the thin November light coming through the window and the city humming its indifferent hum beyond the garden wall. She sat for 10 minutes without moving, without reviewing the documents again, without doing anything except allowing herself to feel the full shape of what Marco had done and what it was going to cost. Everyone, in different ways. Marco himself most of all, though he didn't know that yet. She thought about the night she had walked down those stairs. The girl she had been then. Composed, yes. Functional, yes. But frightened underneath it all in a way she hadn't yet admitted. She thought about the woman she was now, 6 weeks later, sitting in this room with this folder, preparing to deliver to a powerful and privately volatile man the information that his own blood had sold her to an enemy. She was not the same person who had walked into this house. She was not sure yet what she was becoming. But she was becoming it deliberately, with her eyes open, and that was more than she could have said about most of the things she had built her life on before. She stood up. She picked up the folder. She went to find Vincent. He was in the main dining room going over contracts with his lawyer, a compact, silver-haired man named Ferris, whom Arya had met twice and found exacting in a way she respected. When she appeared in the doorway, Vincent looked up, and something in her face communicated itself to him before she said a word, because he was already setting down the contract and saying calmly to Ferris, "Give us the room." Ferris gave them the room. Vincent was standing by the time the door closed, which she hadn't expected. He was looking at her with full, undivided attention, and his face was very still, in the way it got when he had already sensed that something was wrong and was bracing for the shape of it. "Sit down," she said, and she meant it for both of them. They sat, across from each other at the long dining table, and she set the folder between them, and she said, "Caruso traced the source of the information Kessler used. We know how he knew my schedule. We know how he knew the timing." Vincent looked at the folder. He did not reach for it yet. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She used the same careful, complete voice she used for everything she needed him to actually hear. Not hedged, not softened, not managed into something more digestible. The full account, with the documented trail, with the 3 contacts over 10 days, with the implied intention. She watched his face as she spoke. She had expected fury. Vincent's anger and her experience of it so far was not loud, but it was dense. It moved through a room differently than ordinary emotion. It changed the air pressure. She had expected that, amplified. What she saw instead was something she was not prepared for. His face went very still, more still than she had ever seen it. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his reaction, the stillness of a man who had just taken a blow that he had not seen coming and was still in the moment before he understood fully what had been hit. He looked like a father, not a crime lord, not the most feared man in the city, not the controlled, careful, endlessly competent person she had been living beside for 6 weeks. He looked like a man who had just learned that his son, his child, his blood, had tried to have his wife kidnapped. He sat with it for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that his silences were not voids to be filled, but rooms that needed to exist. Finally, he said, "He thought they wouldn't hurt you." "That's what Caruso thinks." "Yes." He thought. Vincent stopped. His jaw worked. He doesn't understand that there is no agreement with people like Kessler. There is no arrangement where you give them what they want and they stop wanting. He doesn't. He stopped again. "He grew up inside your protection," she said quietly. "He never had to understand that." The silence returned, longer this time. "I need to think," he said. His voice was different, stripped of something, the way voices get when the management of a thing has become temporarily impossible. "About what happens next." "I know," she said. "This is my son." "I know," she said again. He looked at her across the table. In his eyes, she saw something that was older than anything else she had seen in him. A grief that was not new, but had just found a new and devastating shape. The grief of a man who had failed to protect his child from his own world, and whose child had responded by turning that world against the one person the man had allowed himself to care about. She reached across the table. It was the first time she had touched him with intention rather than ceremony. Not the arm she took at events, not the choreography of public marriage. She put her hand over his on the table. He looked down at her hand. He did not pull away. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I'm not going anywhere. And whatever happens with Marco, whatever it costs, I need you to make a decision, not a reaction." He turned his hand slowly under hers until their palms were together, and he held on with a grip that was not tight but was complete, the grip of someone holding something they were afraid of losing. "I know," he said. Outside, the city continued its indifferent noise. Inside the estate, in the dining room where decisions were about to be made that would change everything for all of them, they sat across from each other in the long quiet, and the truth settled around them like weather, cold and real and impossible to walk away from. Marco had started a war he didn't understand, and its consequences were already moving, like something that had been in motion for a long time and was only now becoming visible. The 24 hours that followed were the quietest and most dangerous of Arya's time in the Russo estate. Vincent did not sleep. She knew this because she did not sleep either. Not fully, not the kind of sleep that actually restores anything. And at 2 a.m, she heard him in the corridor outside her wing, his footsteps measured and slow. The walk of a man who was doing his thinking on his feet because sitting still had become impossible. She did not go out. She understood that what he needed in those hours was not company, but space. The particular space that a man requires when he is trying to love someone and punish them at the same time, and cannot find a way to do both that he can live with afterward. She lay in the dark and thought about Marco. Not with sympathy, exactly. She was not yet built for that, and she didn't pretend otherwise, but with a kind of cold, clear understanding that was almost worse than sympathy because it left no room for simple feeling. Marco had grown up watching his father operate in a world where power was the only honest currency, where showing weakness invited predation, where every relationship was simultaneously genuine and strategic. He had grown up believing that the rules applied to everyone except himself, because for his entire life, they had. He had grown up assuming that the woman he had discarded would simply disappear, into grief, into obscurity, into the convenient invisibility that he had always assigned to people who existed at the edges of his attention. And when she hadn't disappeared, when she had instead walked into the center of everything he had always taken for granted and made it hers, something in him had broken in a way he hadn't known how to handle. Not with dignity, not with the kind of reckoning that might have made him someone different, with desperation and foolishness and a catastrophic misreading of every force he had put into motion. He had handed coordinates to a predator and called it a plan. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. At 6 a.m, she got up, dressed, and went downstairs. Vincent was already in the study. He looked the way men look after a night of no sleep that they have tried very hard not to show. The control was all there, assembled and functioning, but it was sitting on top of something that had not resolved, like a building constructed on ground that was still settling. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee's on the sideboard," he said. "I know." She poured 2 cups. She set one in front of him and sat down across the desk. "Have you decided?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to speak to Marco today, directly." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm not going to involve the organization in this. It stays between us." She watched him. "And what happens after you speak to him?" "That depends on what he says." His voice was very controlled. "Whether he understands what he did, not what I think he did, what he actually did, the full weight of it. You're giving him a chance to understand it. He's my son." He said it simply, without drama, and it was the most painful thing she had heard him say because it contained everything: the love and the fury and the grief and the impossible arithmetic of a man who had to weigh his blood against everything else. "I know," she said. "I need you to stay in the estate today, not because of protocol." "I know," she said again. "I'll stay." He looked at her across the desk. In the thin morning light, with the sleepless night visible in the architecture of his face, he looked older than he usually allowed himself to look, more human. She had come to understand that Vincent's control was not coldness. It was not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of a man who had learned young that feelings left unmanaged could get people killed, and who had applied that lesson so thoroughly for so many decades that it had become structural. Part of him, the way a scar becomes part of skin. "Are you angry with me?" he said. She blinked. It was not a question she had expected from him. "Why would I be angry with you?" "Because this happened. Because I brought you into this world and told you I could protect you, and then—" "You did protect me," she said. "Reed and Torres were there because you put them there. The system worked." She paused. "You're not responsible for what Marco chose to do." "He's my son," he said again. This time it meant something different. "Yes," she said, "and he made his own choices. Those are different things." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the coffee and drank it, and something in him settled fractionally. Not resolved, but stabilized, the way things stabilize when you've made a decision and are now simply waiting to execute it. "I'll have Caruso set up the meeting for this afternoon," he said. "Marco's apartment." "Not here?" "No." He shook his head. "Not here. This is your home." A pause, as though he was registering what he had said. "I'm not bringing this conversation into your home." She held his gaze across the desk. It occurred to her, not for the first time and not for the last, that this man was both more complicated and more decent than most people who knew his name would ever believe. "All right," she said. "Go. Say what needs to be said." He left at noon with Caruso and 2 men from the security detail, and Arya spent the afternoon in the way she spent all hours that required waiting, working, because work was the thing that kept her mind properly occupied rather than chasing itself in circles. She reviewed the spring campaign materials with Priya over a video call. She answered correspondence. She went through a set of financial documents that the Foundation's accountant had sent for her review, and she identified 3 line items that didn't correspond to anything in the project records, and she made a note to ask about them in the morning. She was in the small sitting room at 4:30 when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Mrs. Russo." The voice was male, accented, unhurried. The unhurriedness of it was the worst part. The particular ease of a man who believed he controlled the terms of every conversation he entered. I understand your husband is across the city having a family discussion. Complicated timing. She said nothing. She was already moving, standing, crossing to the door, opening it. Torres was in the corridor, immediate and alert. My name is Soren Kessler, the voice said. I think it's time we spoke directly. She looked at Torres and mouthed, Get Ricci, now. Torres moved. Arya stayed on the line. I'm listening, she said. You're a remarkable woman, Kessler said, with a warmth that was as genuine as plastic. I've been watching you since Vincent introduced you to the world, the gala, the Mancuso dinner, the way you handled the situation on 47th Street. Most women would have been on the first flight home. You had tea and went back to work. What do you want? She said. Directness. I appreciate that. A brief pause. I want you to deliver a message to your husband, in person, since I understand that's more effective with men like Vincent. You could deliver it yourself. I could, but I think it carries more weight coming from you, and I think, though you may not agree yet, that what I'm about to say is something you'll want him to hear. Another pause. Tell him that the arrangement with his son is concluded. Marco Russo approached us. We did not approach him. We used what he offered because we are not in the habit of refusing information when it arrives on our doorstep. But the boy is a liability, and I have no further use for him. A pause. And tell Vincent that I'm prepared to discuss terms, real terms, not the posturing we've been engaged in for the last 18 months. I'm interested in a conversation. She absorbed this. Her mind was running very fast and very clean, the way it ran when she was doing the thing she was actually good at, taking in information and identifying what was real in it and what was performance. Why? She said. Why now? Why through me? Because the attempt on your safety was a miscalculation. I used information I should have been more cautious with. It was reactive rather than strategic, and reactive moves rarely produce good outcomes. His voice was even, businesslike. I'm a pragmatic man, Mrs. Russo. Continued conflict with your husband costs more than a negotiated arrangement. I've been looking for an entry point to a conversation that isn't preceded by a body count. And you think calling his wife is that entry point? I think calling you is that entry point. You're not simply his wife. You've been in that world for 6 weeks, and you've managed it better than people who've spent decades in it. You're also, I suspect, less committed to the principle of retaliation than your husband is going to be when he finishes his conversation with Marco today. A pause. Am I wrong? She said nothing for a moment. I'll deliver your message, she said. What happens after that is Vincent's decision. Of course. The warmth in his voice was still performative, but something underneath it was more real. The satisfaction of a man who has taken a risk and watched it land correctly. Tell him I'd prefer to have the conversation before he makes any decisions he can't unmake. The line went dead. She stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and the last of the afternoon light going flat and gray through the tall windows. And she ran the conversation back through her mind once, completely, checking every word for what it was actually saying underneath what it said. Kessler was pulling back. Whether it was genuine pragmatism or a more sophisticated form of pressure, she couldn't be entirely certain. But the call itself, made to her directly, framed as it was a signal. And signals had to be read correctly, or they became noise. She called Vincent. He picked up on the second ring. Arya? Where are you? Still at Marco's. We're... A pause, and in the pause she heard something she didn't like. A compression in his voice that meant the conversation with Marco had gone somewhere difficult. We're still talking. I need to tell you something, she said. When you're done, come home first. Is something? I'm fine. Everyone here is fine. But come home before you make any decisions about anything, please. A long pause. All right, he said. An hour. He was back in 50 minutes, which told her the conversation with Marco had reached whatever ending it was going to reach. He came through the front door with Caruso behind him, and his face was in its most controlled configuration. The one that meant the thing underneath was very large and required maximum management. She was waiting in the study. He came in, saw her, and sat down without removing his coat. She told him about the call, completely, in the same thorough way she told him everything. He listened without moving. When she finished, the silence was different from his usual silences. Denser, pressurized. He called you, Vincent said. Yes. On your personal number? Yes. His jaw tightened. That's another demonstration. He's showing that his information access goes beyond the schedule breach. He has more than what Marco gave him. I know, she said. Or he wants us to think he does. She paused. How did it go with Marco? The silence that followed was the longest he had produced in her presence. She watched his face go through something. Not visible emotion, Vincent didn't work that way, but a kind of internal weather that showed in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. He didn't understand, Vincent said. Not fully. He understood that he'd made contact with Kessler's people. He understood that information changed hands. He paused. He didn't understand what that meant, what it could have meant for you. What did he say? He said he hadn't thought they would actually... Vincent stopped. His voice had changed. Not louder, but raw at the edges in a way she had not heard from him before. He said he thought it would just scare you, make you reconsider. He said he didn't think anyone would get hurt. He was probably right that they wouldn't have, she said carefully. Kessler said the attempt was a miscalculation. He used the information more aggressively than Marco intended. That's not a defense. No, she agreed. It's not. Vincent stood up. He moved to the window, not looking out at anything, just moving, the way he moved when the stillness became untenable. I told him to leave the city, he said. I told him to go to the house in Connecticut and stay there until I told him otherwise, that he was under no circumstances to make contact with anyone in or adjacent to the organization. She waited. He asked me if he was still my son. The words landed in the room with the weight of something that had been dropped from a height. She sat with them. What did you say? She asked quietly. I told him he would always be my son, and I told him that the two things, being my son and what he had done, were not mutually exclusive, that both of them were true at the same time, that he would have to live with both of them. He turned from the window. His face was a controlled surface over something she could only partially see, like ice over deep water. I don't know if that was the right answer. I'm not sure there is a right answer. There isn't, she said. There's only the honest one, and that was honest. He looked at her across the room. I'm going to speak to Kessler, he said. Not because I trust him, but because you're right that a decision made in reaction to this moment is different from one made after thinking clearly. You remembered that. You said it twice, he said. I tend to remember things people say twice. She stood up. I think Kessler's call was genuine, in the pragmatic sense. He's not afraid of conflict, but he's done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic doesn't favor it. He's looking for a way to reframe the relationship. He may be, Vincent said, or this is a longer game. It may be that too. She paused. But the call itself tells us something. He chose to engage with you through me, not through a lawyer, not through intermediary channels, through your wife, in a direct conversation. That's either respect or it's a reading of your vulnerabilities. She met his eyes, which means either way, the response matters. How did he seem to you? Vincent said. On the call. She thought about it honestly. Intelligent, controlled, like a man who has run his own calculations and doesn't like the result he's been getting. She paused. Like someone who wants to stop fighting without losing face. Vincent was quiet for a long time, then, I'll set up the meeting through Caruso. Neutral ground, our lawyers and his. He looked at her. I want you there. She blinked. At the meeting. Not in the room necessarily, but present. Available. He held her gaze. You read him in 3 minutes on a phone call you weren't prepared for. I want that available to me. All right, she said. Yes. The meeting with Kessler was set for the following Thursday, which gave them 6 days. Days that passed in the strange, suspended quality of time before something significant, where ordinary life continues, but each hour has an extra weight to it, a consciousness of what is coming. Arya worked. She maintained the foundation commitments. She went to a board meeting on Tuesday and handled a delicate conversation with a major donor whose expectations had outpaced the foundation's capacity. And she handled it well enough that Vincent, who heard about it from Caruso, said simply at breakfast the next morning, "Good job with Harrington." He just needed to feel heard, she said. People who give money sometimes need to feel like it matters as much to you as it does to them. Does it? The foundation's work matters to me, she said. That's close enough. It was Wednesday evening. 36 hours before the Kessler meeting, when Marco came back. Not to the estate, not through any official channel. He called Arya's phone at 7:15 while she was in the upstairs library. A call from the number she had blocked months ago that somehow came through anyway, which told her he had gotten a new number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was different from every previous time she had heard it, stripped of the charm, stripped of the defensiveness, stripped of the bewildered fury. What was left underneath was something younger and less armored. "Not to convince you of anything, not about the marriage, just, I need to talk to you." She thought about it for a moment. "Where are you?" "Connecticut." A pause. "I've been here a week. He stopped. She heard him exhale. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what I did." Another pause. "About what I almost did." A third pause, longer than the others. "I didn't think it would go that far. I want you to know that. I know it doesn't. I know that doesn't make it better, but I need you to know I didn't think—" "I know," she said. Silence. "You know?" "I know you didn't think they'd actually hurt me," she said. "That doesn't change what you did, but I know that. He stopped, started again. "When you married him, I felt like the floor disappeared. I know how that sounds. I know I did what I did with Danny, and I know that was—" He stopped a third time. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for any of it. I just needed to tell someone who would tell me the truth, whether what I did was, if there's—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "There's no version of what you did that was okay," she said, quietly, without cruelty. "Not the 7 months with Danny, not the contact with Kessler, not any of it." She paused. "But you're 29 years old and you made catastrophic decisions because you couldn't handle a consequence. That's survivable, if you let it change you. Does he know I called you?" "No." She paused. "He will." A long silence. "Are you going to tell him?" "Yes," she said. "I don't keep things from him. Even things that, especially those things." She looked out the library window at the dark garden below. "Marco, your father loves you. That's not a small thing. Don't waste it." He was quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. Then, Is he going to be okay with the Kessler thing? I mean, what I started." "Yes," she said. "He's handling it." "Because of you," Marco said. And there was something in his voice, not resentment, not the way there would have been 2 months ago. Something that was grudging and genuine and cost him something to say. "He's different with you there," Caruso said. "Someone told me he's different." A pause. "I don't know if I'm glad about that, but I think maybe I should be." "Get some sleep, Marco," she said gently. "Let your father handle the meeting tomorrow. Stay in Connecticut and let things settle." "The meeting?" "Good night, Marco." She ended the call. She sat in the library for a moment, with the dark garden below and the city's permanent glow on the horizon, and she thought about the strange, complicated ecosystem of this family, its damage and its love, and the way those two things were so thoroughly woven through each other that separating them might not be possible, might not even be desirable. She went to find Vincent and told him about the call. He listened. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then, what did he sound like? "Like someone who's starting to understand what he did," she said carefully. "Not there yet, but starting." Vincent nodded. He didn't say anything else, but something in his face shifted. The ice over deep water, and beneath it, just briefly, the movement of something that was not as frozen as the surface suggested. Thursday came. The meeting was at a hotel in Midtown, a conference room on the 32nd floor that Caruso had booked under a corporate name, neutral in the technical sense that it belonged to neither party. Vincent's legal team was there. A woman named Holt, who was Kessler's lead attorney, arrived 8 minutes after them, precise, auburn-haired, with the brisk competence of someone who charged by the quarter hour and was worth every cent. Arya was in a room 2 doors down the corridor with Torres, and a view of the door through a tablet connected to a camera Ricci had installed in the conference room that morning. She watched the meeting through the small screen with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language she was still learning but had become genuinely proficient in. Kessler was not what she had built from his voice. She had imagined something that matched the cold pragmatism of the phone call, something harder, more obviously predatory. What she saw on the screen was a man in his early 40s who was trim and unremarkable in the best suit money could buy, with light eyes and the kind of face that was easy to underestimate precisely because it didn't try to impress. He shook Vincent's hand across the table with the ease of a man who had done this 100 times, and had long since stopped finding it charged. They talked for 90 minutes. She watched. She made notes on this pad she had brought, fast and precise, flagging the moments where Kessler's body language said something different from his words, the moments where Vincent's control shifted by a fraction, the moments where one attorney looked at the other in a way that meant something was landing that they hadn't anticipated. At the 90-minute mark, both men stood. They shook hands again. Kessler said something she couldn't fully hear through the tablet audio. Vincent responded with something equally low, and then it was over. Vincent came to her room 2 minutes later. He closed the door behind him. He sat down across from her and looked at her with an expression of contained exhaustion that was the closest she had seen him come to simply being tired. "Well," she said, "he wants territorial lines redrawn formally. A mediator from the Mancuso organization, Dominic, which he's agreed to, and a 6-month cooling period with no escalatory action from either side." He paused. "In exchange, he's pulling all surveillance on the estate and on you, in writing." "In writing," she said. "Legally useless," he said, "but symbolically significant. It's a commitment in a context where he has witnesses." He paused. "It's not trust, it's managed coexistence." "Is that enough?" "For now." He looked at her. "It won't hold forever. Men like Kessler don't stop wanting what they want, but it creates space, time to build something stronger." He was quiet for a moment. "You were right about him. He's pragmatic. He did the arithmetic." "You read him too," she said. "I watched you in there." "I read him differently than you would have." He paused. "I want to know what you saw from the tablet, what I missed." She told him. She went through her notes methodically. The moments she had flagged, what she thought they indicated, where she thought Kessler's real concerns lay underneath the formal negotiating positions. Vincent listened with the total attention he gave everything she said, and twice he said something that indicated he had seen the same thing from inside the room, and once he said I didn't catch that in a way that made her understand the value of having 2 sets of eyes on the same room from different angles. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You should have been in there," he said. "Next time," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was different from anything she had catalogued yet. Not the controlled assessment, not the private worry she had occasionally glimpsed, not the grief that Marco's choices had produced. Something that was quieter and more straightforward and more frightening for that reason. "Arya," he said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." He paused. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." She looked at him across the small hotel room table, with the city spread out behind him through the window and the afternoon light making everything look slightly unreal, and she waited. "When Caruso told me about the abduction attempt," he said, "before you came to find me, I sat in the car for 4 minutes, and I didn't do anything. Caruso told me later that that had never happened before, that I had always been the one making decisions, that the 4 minutes scared him more than anything that had happened operationally." He paused. "I didn't tell you that." "No," she said. "I was scared," he said. The word came out like something that cost him physically. Not of what Kessler would do next. Not of the operational situation. "I was scared because—" He stopped, started again. "You've been in this house for 6 weeks. You've been—" He looked at his hands. "I've been in this world for 30 years. I've learned not to build things that can be taken from me. That's how you survive it." She said nothing. She let him finish. "I seem to have built something anyway," he said quietly, "without particularly intending to." The hotel room was very quiet. Outside, the city went about its business at 32 floors below, indifferent and constant. She looked at him across the table. This complicated, controlled, privately decent man who had offered her power and given her something she hadn't thought to ask for, who had told her the truth from the first conversation and kept telling it, even when it was difficult, who had stood in a foyer and recognized her at the bottom of a staircase on the worst night of her life. "I know," she said. "You knew." "I suspected." She paused. "I've been building something too." "I didn't intend to either." He held her gaze. The control was still there. It was always there. It was structural. But what was underneath it was visible in a way it hadn't been before. Visible and not being hidden. "What do we do with that?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the agreement in the lawyer's office, the terms negotiated carefully by two people who had been trying to keep things contractual and manageable and defined. She thought about the morning breakfasts and the late-night briefings, and the hand held across the dining table, and the way he had said "you're home" without realizing what it revealed. "I think," she said slowly, "that we stop pretending it's only what we agreed it was." He was still for a long moment. Then, with the particular precision of a man who only moved when he was certain, "Yes." Outside, the city hummed. Inside, something settled between them. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories that are trying too hard. Quietly. The way things settle when they have been moving toward a place for a while and have finally arrived. They sat together in the settling, and the light changed through the windows, and the day went on around them. But something had ended, and something else, not arranged, not strategic, not the careful architecture of mutual benefit, had begun. And downstairs in Connecticut, Vincent's son was sitting with the weight of what he had done, trying to learn the shape of consequence. And in the hotel corridor outside, Torres was eating a vending machine sandwich and checking her phone. And in the mansion, Mrs. Callahan was supervising the preparation of dinner for two, as she did every evening now, for the man who never used to come home for dinner and the woman who had made him want to. The war that Marco had started was settling toward an uneasy peace. The cost of it was still being counted, and the counting was not finished yet. The peace lasted 19 days. Arya counted them afterward. Not at the time, she was too busy living inside them to number them, but afterward, when she needed to understand the shape of what had happened, she counted. 19 days of the careful, managed coexistence that the Kessler Agreement had purchased. 19 days of territorial lines being observed and surveillance being withdrawn, and the low operational hum of the estate settling into something that was not quite relaxed but was considerably less pressurized than the weeks before. 19 days during which she and Vincent had been doing the quiet, unannounced work of becoming something to each other that neither of them had a clean word for yet. It was not dramatic. That was the thing she would always remember about it, that it didn't announce itself, didn't arrive with the cinematic weight that the circumstances surrounding it might have suggested. It was breakfast conversations that ran longer than they needed to. It was him appearing in the doorway of the small sitting room where she worked and saying nothing for a moment before he said whatever he had come to say, as though he had arrived slightly before the reason had. It was her learning the specific quality of his silences. Which ones meant he was thinking, which ones meant he was managing something, which one, the rarest one, meant he was at peace. It was the evening 3 days after the hotel meeting when she was reviewing foundation materials at the dining table and he sat down across from her without asking, without explanation, and read something of his own. A contract, she thought, though she didn't ask. And they sat in the same pool of lamplight for 2 hours without speaking, and it was not awkward. It was the most natural thing that had happened to her in years. She called her mother on a Sunday. Her mother, who had been carefully neutral since the phone call before the wedding, who had asked the right questions and suppressed the others, who loved Arya with the fierce practicality of a woman who had raised a daughter alone in a small town and had never fully stopped worrying about what the larger world would do to her. "Are you happy?" her mother said. Not "are you safe?" Not "is this what you wanted?" but the simple, direct question that cut through everything else. Arya thought about it honestly. She was sitting at the window of her wing looking out at the November garden, which had gone skeletal and austere in the way of late autumn gardens, beautiful in the way of things that aren't trying. "I think so," she said. "I'm not sure I've been happy in a straightforward way in a long time. But yes, I think so." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He treats you well?" "Yes," she said. And then, because her mother deserved more than that, "He tells me the truth. He respects what I think. There was a situation a few weeks ago, something dangerous, and he was more frightened for me than he was for anything else." She paused. "He's not a simple man, but he's a good one, in the ways that matter." "That's more than most people get," her mother said. "Yes," Arya said. "I know." She didn't tell her mother about Marco, not yet. There were things that needed to happen before that conversation could be had clearly, and she had learned, in this new life, that timing was the difference between information and damage. Marco was still in Connecticut. Vincent spoke to him by phone every few days, but brief calls, the content of which he didn't share with Arya in detail, but whose emotional tenor she could read from his face afterward. The calls left him quieter than usual. Not sad, exactly. More like a man carrying something heavy who has decided that putting it down is not yet an option and has organized himself accordingly. She didn't press. She had learned when to give him space and when to enter it, and this was a space she gave. It was the 19th day when Marco came back. Not announced. Not through Caruso or through any of the channels that would have prepared them. He drove himself, alone, which was itself a signal, Marco never going anywhere alone, and arrived at the estate gate at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening when the sky had gone fully dark and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that feels like a statement. The gate camera caught him. Ricci notified Caruso. Caruso came to the study where Vincent and Arya were sitting after dinner, sitting in the easy, unannounced way they had begun to sit together in the evenings, and said, with his most careful professional neutrality, "Marco is at the gate. He's asking to come in." Vincent was still for a moment. He looked at Arya. She looked back at him. "Let him in," she said. "Arya, he came alone," she said. "He drove himself. He's asking, not demanding." She paused. "Let him in." Vincent looked at her for another moment. Then he said to Caruso, "Open the gate." Marco came into the house looking like someone who had spent 19 days in genuine reckoning and had not enjoyed a moment of it. The easy handsomeness was still there. It was structural. It wasn't going anywhere. But everything that had been layered on top of it, the gloss and the performance, had been stripped down to something raw and less comfortable. He stood in the foyer and looked at his father and then at Arya with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a dozen versions of this moment and has arrived to find that none of them are the right one. "Dad," he said, and then to Arya. "Arya." "Marco," Vincent said. "Come in." They went to the sitting room, not the study, which felt too much like a room where judgments were delivered. The sitting room was warmer, less formal, and Arya had made it subtly hers over the past weeks in the way she made spaces hers, through the accumulation of working materials and books and the particular arrangement of things that communicated ongoing habitation. Marco sat. He didn't take off his coat immediately, then did, the physical indecision of someone who hasn't settled into the room yet. He looked at his hands. He looked at his father. He looked briefly at Arya. "I've been thinking," he said. "For 19 days I've been sitting in that house thinking, and He stopped. "I don't know how to do this." "Say what you came to say," Vincent said, quietly, without edge. Marco looked at his father. "I'm sorry," he said. I know what I did doesn't..." He stopped again. "I put Arya in danger. I gave information to people who had no reason to exercise restraint with it, and I told myself it would be fine, that nothing would actually happen, that I was just..." He shook his head. "I was trying to undo something that wasn't mine to undo. She made a choice. It wasn't my choice to disrupt." A pause. "I think I knew that. I just couldn't accept it." The sitting room was quiet. The fire was low. Outside, the wind moved through the skeletal garden. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Marco said, and he looked at Arya as he said it. I know that's not something I can ask for. I just needed to say it directly, to your face, that I'm sorry, that I understand what I did." He paused, "and that I don't, that I'm glad you're okay. I'm genuinely glad." Arya looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had stood at the top of the stairs 2 months ago and looked into that room and had her world rearranged. She thought about the 7 months. She thought about Danny, whose name had not been spoken aloud in this house since the beginning, and who existed now as a kind of negative space, the shape of a betrayal rather than a person. She thought about everything Marco had cost her, and everything, unexpectedly, that the costing had led to. "I hear you," she said. "Thank you for saying it directly." He looked at her. "That's not forgiveness." "No," she said. "It's not. But it's something." She paused. "Forgiveness takes time, Marco. You don't get to request it on a schedule. What you can do is give it the conditions it needs to happen in, which means being the person who deserves it." She held his gaze. "That's the work. It's not one conversation." He nodded slowly. Something in his face, the youngest, least offended part of it, accepted this with the particular gravity of someone receiving a truth they already knew but needed to hear spoken. He looked at his father. Vincent had been watching the exchange with a stillness that she recognized as the most profound version of his control, the kind that happened when he was feeling something very large and was giving it no expression at all, because expressing it would require the wrong kind of strength. His hands were on his knees. His face was entirely still. "Dad," Marco said. "I'm here," Vincent said. Just that. Marco looked at him with something that was not quite the face of a 29-year-old man and not quite the face of a much younger boy, and was somehow both simultaneously. "Am I still—" He stopped. "You told me I would always be your son." "Yes," Vincent said. "I need to know what that means now, what it actually means. Not the theoretical version, what it means going forward." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Arya watched him find the words, watched the effort of it, the care, the way a man who has spent 30 years building himself into something efficient and contained now had to dismantle some of that to find the language for what he actually felt. "It means I'm not going anywhere," Vincent said. "It means what you did had consequences, and those consequences are real, and they're not finished yet. It means there are things that will need to be rebuilt between us that cannot be rushed." He paused. "And it means that none of that changes the fact that you're my son. Those things coexist. They're both true." Marco pressed his lips together. His eyes were bright. "Okay," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Okay." They sat together in the sitting room for another hour. The conversation that followed was not easy. There were things that needed to be said that had never been said. A reckoning between a father and a son that had been postponed for years and had finally run out of postponements. Arya was present for some of it and absent for some of it, moving in and out as the conversation required. Getting coffee. Finding a reason to be in the corridor for 20 minutes when the exchange between the two of them became the kind of private that needed no audience. When she came back the second time, something had shifted in the room. Not resolved. Marco's mistakes were not the kind that resolved in a single evening, but shifted. The particular tension that had existed between Vincent and his son since the night of the original dinner party had changed its quality. It was still there, but it was oriented differently, towards something rather than away from something. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Marco left at 11. He shook Vincent's hand at the door. And then, with the visible effort of someone doing something that cost them and doing it anyway, he looked at Arya and said, "For what it's worth. He's different with you here. Better." A pause. "I didn't want to see that at first, but I see it." She nodded. "Good night, Marco." He went. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. Vincent stood at the closed front door for a moment with his back to her, not moving. She waited. When he turned around, his face was not the controlled surface. It was the thing beneath it, exposed, human, older than it usually allowed itself to be. And in it she saw the full weight of what the evening had been for him. The grief that his son had required this much damage to become capable of a genuine apology, the complicated love that made the grief possible, the exhaustion of 30 years of building a world that had ultimately circled back and asked him to pay for it in this particular currency. She crossed the foyer to him. She didn't say anything. She simply put her arms around him. The first time, the real first time, not the formal contact of public appearances or the intentional gesture across a table, but simply holding on. And after a moment, his arms came around her, and he held on too, with the grip of someone who had been told for 30 years that holding on was what made you vulnerable, and had finally decided that the alternative was worse. They stood in the foyer in the dark quiet for a long time. December came. And with December came the particular clarity that cold weather produces in a city, the air sharp enough to make the world look defined, edges you couldn't see in summer suddenly visible and precise. The Foundation's spring campaign launched its preliminary phase in the first week of December, and it was by every measurable standard the most successful outreach the organization had produced in its history. Arya's restructuring of the communications strategy, combined with Priya's talent for the operational details, and the genuine quality of the work the Foundation was funding, created something that registered in the city as real. Not as a wealthy man's charity project, as an actual effort. Newspapers covered it. 3 other foundations reached out about potential partnerships. The community health clinic, whose grant application Arya had flagged in November, received their funding and sent a letter that she read 3 times. She pinned it to the wall of the small sitting room, which was entirely hers now in every sense. Vincent saw it there one evening and read it without commenting. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her with the quiet, direct expression that meant he was about to say something true. "This is what it was supposed to be," he said, "from the beginning. This is what I wanted it to be." "I know," she said. "That's why I came here." He looked at the letter again. "You could run it," he said. "Formally, executive director. It would require board approval, but the board does what I recommend." He paused. "But I want it to be your decision, not mine. If you do it, it should be because you want it, not because it's what fits the arrangement." She thought about it for a moment. Not long. "Yes," she said, "I want it." "Good," he said. It was that simple. It was exactly that simple. And the simplicity of it was, she was beginning to understand, one of his particular qualities. This ability to make large things uncomplicated when they didn't need to be complicated. He reserved complexity for things that were actually complex. Everything else he did cleanly. She was coming to love that about him. She was coming to love several things about him, in the careful, honest way she had decided to approach everything in this life. With her eyes open, without the performance of feeling things she didn't, without the suppression of feeling things she did. She told him this on an evening in the middle of December, not dramatically, not with the weight that some declarations carry. They were in the study, the room where everything in this story had begun, where an offer had been made and accepted over 2 glasses of water and a fire burning low. And the fire was burning low again, and she had just finished telling him about a conversation with Priya, and he had just finished telling her about the progress of the Kessler territorial negotiation, and there was a pause. And in the pause she said, "I think I love you." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it to create a situation," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I've decided I'm not going to not say things that are true because they're inconvenient." She paused. "You can respond however you want, or not respond. I don't need—" "Arya," he said. "Yes." "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his most intimate expression. Not warmth exactly, not softness, but the removal of everything that usually stood between him and the world. "I've been trying to find the right moment to say it back. Is this the right moment?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." And he said it, quietly, with the particular weight of a man who does not say things lightly and means everything he says. "I love you." The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The city hummed beyond the garden wall. She smiled. A real smile, the unperformed kind. "That wasn't so difficult," she said. "It was extremely difficult," he said. "Don't minimize it." She laughed. And he looked at her laughing with an expression that was openly, unguardedly fond. The expression of a man watching something he didn't expect to have, and is still slightly surprised by the having of it. The confrontation came on a Wednesday, not the one they had been anticipating, not from the direction they had been watching. It came from the remaining wound in the situation, the piece of the Kessler arrangement that had never been fully clean. The third shipping partner, the one who had waited a week before coming to Vincent, the one who had been watched and found wanting. His name was Brennan. He had been in the Russo organization's orbit for 11 years, long enough to know everything and short enough to still harbor the ambitions of someone who hadn't been given what he felt he deserved. Caruso had been watching him since November, had flagged him twice in intelligence briefings, had noted the anomalies in his communication patterns that suggested contact with parties that shouldn't have existed on his contact list. What none of them had known, what became known on that Wednesday at 9:15 in the evening, was that Brennan had been in contact with Kessler, not to replace the Russo organization, but to supplement it, to provide a second channel, to position himself as the person who could give Kessler access to the estate's operational rhythms in ways that Marco's earlier involvement had only begun to suggest. He had a key, a physical key to a service entrance on the north side of the property, obtained through a maintenance contractor that the estate had used for 3 years. He had 4 men with him. He had chosen Wednesday because Wednesday was when the security rotation changed over, and the window between outgoing and incoming shift had historically been 12 minutes. He had calculated correctly. He had simply not calculated for the fact that Caruso had placed a secondary camera on the north service entrance 2 weeks prior, and that Ricci monitored it continuously, and that the 12-minute window had been quietly reduced to 4. Arya was in her sitting room when the alarm sounded. Not a bell, not anything dramatic, simply the specific vibration pattern on her phone that Reed had set up in October and which she had never needed to use. She was on her feet before she had consciously processed it. She was at the door of the room before Reed was in the corridor, which told her something about the speed of her own reaction that she filed away for later. North entrance, Reed said. 4 individuals. One confirmed as Brennan. Ricci has eyes. Caruso is with Mr. Russo. Where is he? Study. Take me there. They moved through the corridor, quickly, without running, because Reed had told her once that running created noise, and noise created variables, and variables in contained situations were always the enemy. She matched his pace. Torres materialized from somewhere and fell in on her other side, and the 3 of them moved through the house with the focused efficiency of people who had prepared for this without knowing when it would come. The study door was open. Vincent was already standing, already with Caruso, already in the mode she had only seen approaching before tonight. The complete operational presence of a man who had built his life around managing exactly this kind of moment. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something in his face tightened. I told Reed to take you to the safe room, he said. I'm here instead, she said. What's happening? Brennan's inside the north perimeter. 3 of our people are moving to intercept. Kessler's team. He stopped. Is Kessler involved? She said. We don't know yet, Caruso said. The communication patterns suggested Brennan was operating independently, trying to establish his own value to Kessler. This may be freelance. Which is worse, she said, because freelance means unpredictable. Yes, Caruso said. From somewhere in the house, the north corridor, she estimated, trying to translate the geography against her memory of the estate's layout, she heard the compressed sounds of a physical confrontation. Not gunfire. Not yet. The sounds of men who were trained and moving through a space with intent. Vincent was on the phone. 2 calls simultaneously, something she hadn't seen him do before. The phone held to one ear while the other was relayed through Caruso, and his voice was in the clipped directive mode that was the operational version of him. Commands, information, the rapid processing of inputs and outputs. She stayed out of the way. Not passively. She had positioned herself with a clear sightline to the study door and a clear path to the window, and she was tracking everything she could hear and see with the journalist's habit of building a picture from fragments. But she was not in the way of what needed to happen. It was 7 minutes, she counted. 7 minutes from the alarm on her phone to the sound of Caruso's phone ringing and Ricci's voice on the other end saying things that made Caruso's face shift through 2 expressions before settling into something that was not quite relief. It's contained, Caruso said. Brennan and 2 of his people are secured. The other 2 ran. Ricci has the north corridor. Injuries? Vincent said. Malone took a hit, non-critical. Caruso paused. Brennan is... A pause. Brennan is talking. Immediately. Before anyone asked him to. The room processed this. Freelance, Vincent said. Appears so. He was trying to deliver something to Kessler as a gift. An independent demonstration of value. Caruso's voice was professionally neutral, and underneath it was the particular contempt that competent people reserve for the incompetent actions of people who should have known better. He didn't coordinate with Kessler. Kessler didn't know. Vincent was still for a moment. Then he said to Arya, Are you all right? Yes, she said. Are you? He looked at her. In the controlled operational face, that thing was there again. The private exposed thing that appeared when she was the subject of his attention rather than the situation. Yes, he said. Now. Caruso stepped out. Reed stepped out. For a moment, it was just the 2 of them in the study, in the lamp-lit room where this story had begun, and the house was doing its settling after crisis adjustment, and the clock was ticking, and the fire had burned down to coals. It's over, she said. Not a question. Brennan is handled, he said. Kessler will need to know that his unilateral approach was tried tonight by someone operating without his knowledge. That changes the negotiation. In our favor, she said, significantly. He looked at her. He'll want to formalize the arrangement now. Make it clear he's not directing attacks. The last thing Kessler needs is to be associated with a freelance operation that went wrong inside my estate. So we call him first thing in the morning, she said, from a position of strength, not to threaten, to offer him the clarity he needs. We know it wasn't him. We're choosing to believe it formally. That's a gift, and he'll know it. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Exactly that. I'll be in the meeting, she said. In the room this time. Yes, he said. You will. He shunned. January came in cold and clear, the way it sometimes does in the city, when winter decides to be honest rather than gray. The Kessler meeting happened in the second week. Arya in the room, as agreed, seated at Vincent's right hand at the neutral table, which she understood was a statement in itself, and made no attempt to minimize. Kessler looked at her with the precise, assessing gaze of someone encountering a variable that has exceeded its original estimation. She looked back with the steadiness she had been building since October. The conversation was direct. The Brennan situation, handled, contained, resolved in the Russo organization's favor, had produced the shift in power that Vincent had anticipated. Kessler needed the formalized arrangement more than he had in November. He said so, in the careful language of men who don't say things directly, and Vincent received it in the same language, and Arya watched both of them and understood every word. When it was done, and when the lawyers had the framework and the timeline and the specific territorial parameters that would define the peace going forward, Kessler looked across the table at Arya. You were right, he said, just to her. About what? She said. You told me on the phone that what happened after your message to Vincent would be his decision. He paused. I wasn't sure he'd choose correctly. Men like Vincent, men like me, we tend toward the response that demonstrates strength even when it costs more than the alternative. He looked at her with the frank respect of a pragmatist, acknowledging a useful force. You influenced that. He chose correctly on his own, she said. I just gave him time. Kessler almost smiled. That's a considerable skill, he said, giving men like him time. Yes, she said. It is. The Foundation's executive director announcement was made in February at a board meeting that was, by design, low-key. A formal vote, a brief statement, a handshake with the board chair who had been appropriately curious and had become, in the months since the gala, something approaching an ally. The announcement generated a brief notice in 2 business publications. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that needed to be dramatic. What mattered was what it represented. Arya Caldwell Russo, in the role that was genuinely hers, doing work that was genuinely real, in a life that had become, impossibly, through a sequence of events that she could not have designed, exactly what she had been trying to build since she had left Ohio with one suitcase and the stubborn conviction that she was meant for something bigger. She called her mother that night. Her mother cried, which she had not done since Arya was a child, and which Arya found she was entirely unprepared for. Mom, I'm just glad, her mother said. I'm so glad. So am I, Arya said. She meant it in more ways than she tried to count. Marco came to the Foundation's first community event in March, a health fair at a clinic in the Bronx that the Foundation's grant had helped expand. He came without announcement, having heard about it through Caruso, and he arrived late and stayed in the background and didn't make it about himself. He helped set up chairs. He talked to a woman whose daughter was a patient at the clinic with the careful, slightly stilted kindness of someone practicing a way of being in the world that doesn't come naturally yet, but is being learned. Arya watched him from across the room. He caught her watching and looked back with an expression that was still complicated. It would probably always be complicated, but in which she could now see, unmistakably, the beginnings of something that might eventually become the person he had not yet had the conditions to be. She nodded at him. He nodded back. It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of everything that had happened. It was something more honest than either of those things. 2 people acknowledging each other across the distance that one of them had created, and deciding that the distance, while real, was not infinite. On an evening in April, the garden came back. She was standing at the window of the small sitting room, her room, wholly hers now, in every sense, watching the first green appear in the beds that had been skeletal since October, and she was thinking about nothing in particular. The pleasant, empty thinking of someone whose mind has been given permission to rest, when Vincent appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, not speaking, in the way he sometimes appeared in doorways, arriving slightly before the reason, letting himself simply be present before language was required. The Foundation filed the partnership agreement with the hospital board today, she said, without turning. Gloria Park signed off. She called it the most efficiently structured proposal the board has received in a decade. I know, he said. Priya told Caruso. Caruso told me, "Your information network is remarkably efficient. It has its uses." She turned around. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, in the relaxed configuration she had come to understand as one of his most natural states. Not performing ease, but actually at ease, which was different. He looked at her the way he looked at her now, which was directly and without management, the full attention and no curtain between it and her. "Come look at the garden," she said. "Things are coming back." He crossed the room. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the green coming up through the brown, the stubborn particular green of things that have spent months underground and are now, finally, deciding it's time. "Next month," she said, "I want to have people here. A dinner, not a business dinner, an actual dinner. Elena Mancuso, Priya, Caruso and his wife, if he has one." "He has a wife," Vincent said. "She's remarkable. He doesn't deserve her." "Does Caruso know you think that?" "He does," he said. "I've told him." She laughed. "A dinner," she said. "Something that's just people we like in this house, eating food, something normal." "We can do that," he said. "I know we can." She paused. "I'm just saying I want to." He looked at her. He put his hand over hers on the window ledge, the same motion she had made in November, across the dining table, and which he had remembered and was now returning deliberately, as a kind of answer to everything that had passed since. "Then we will," he said. She leaned against him, slightly, and he shifted to accommodate it without comment, the easy automatic adjustment of two people who have learned each other's physical grammar. Outside, the garden continued its patient return. The city hummed. The clock ticked somewhere in the house with the certainty of something that had always been exactly in this place and always would be. She thought about the girl who had walked into this house on a Saturday in October with a dress bought on sale and a carefully maintained pride, and the particular devastation of someone who has just watched 2 years of belief collapse in under 3 minutes. She thought about what that girl had done with the devastation, not dissolved it, not pretended it hadn't happened, but walked through it and out the other side into something she couldn't have imagined from where she'd been standing. She thought about what it had cost, Marco's terrible choices and their terrible consequences. The nights she had lain awake calculating risks, the moments of fear she had refused to let direct her, the hand held across a table, and the arms around a man in a dark foyer, and the slow incremental brave work of letting someone pass the walls that a previous heartbreak had motivated her to build. She thought about what it had given her in return. Power. The real kind. Not the kind that came from a name or a marriage contract, but the kind that came from discovering the full measure of what you were capable of when the circumstances required it. Work that mattered. A home, actual and felt, not just formal and legal. And this man beside her, complicated, controlled, privately decent, quietly devoted, who had looked at her at the bottom of a staircase and seen something worth seeing. Outside, a bird landed in the garden. She didn't know what kind. It sat on the edge of one of the stone planters for a moment, bright and purposeful, and then it was gone. "Vincent," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad I said yes." He was quiet for a moment. His hand tightened over hers slightly. "So am I," he said, "every day." The garden went on greening. April went on arriving. And in the Russo estate, in the house that had begun as a symbol of power and become, quietly and without announcement, a home, two people stood at a window and watched things come back to life. And they were content. Not in the simple way of people for whom nothing difficult has ever happened, but in the harder, truer way of people who have walked through the difficult and found each other still standing on the other side. That was enough. That was in fact everything.